Hey there, welcome to Bedtime Chills. Tonight, enjoy 3 hours of terrifying true scary stories with soothing rain sounds to help you relax. If these tales give you the creeps, hit that like button and subscribe to join our chilling community. Where are you tuning in from and what time are you listening? Drop a comment below. Now, get cozy and let the night's chills begin. I had a very creepy friend. We'll call him Ben. I believe he might be a dangerous psychopath or at worst a serial killer. Ben and I met on FB in 2014, and he came to meet me in Romania in the summer of 2015. He seemed a little bit odd, but otherwise okay. One strange thing about him is that while he was at my house for a week, he didn't bathe for some odd reason, so he stank. So I showed him around Transylvania, and we both rented an apartment in Bucharest before his departure. We hung around Bucharest, and he left. Our friendship continued online, and in 2016, I moved back to Canada. In May of that year, I flew over to Vancouver to hang out with him. Now, it is important to know that this guy is a major gun nut. He collects a lot of firearms and claims to have briefly been in the Canadian Army. He also claims he worked as a mercenary and was in Georgia during the Russian invasion in 2008. He claimed to have shot 2 people there and also suffers from PTSD. I got there, and his apartment was filthy. I'm talking trash everywhere, 2 cats that made the place stink of cat urine. The guy kept his lights on 24/7, and on his wall was a clock that played a loud tune every hour. His behavior towards me while there was somewhat disrespectful, but I just took it as a buddy messing around with me. He said mildly creepy things, but again I brushed it off as him being a prankster. I left, and again our friendship continued online. During this time, his conversations with me became darker and more hostile in a passive-aggressive sort of way. Ben is also a hardcore alcoholic who drinks until he passes out. He does all sorts of antisocial and downright vile things while drunk. Also, during this time, 2016 to 2017, he said that 2 men briefly lived with him for a short time. When I pressed him about what happened to those 2 men who lived with him, he changed the subject quickly. After what happened in 2018 when I last met up with Ben, I have a strong suspicion something bad might have happened to them. So, fast forward to 2018, and my parents and I are driving to Vancouver from Calgary. Perfect time to meet up for a day or 2 with Ben. Big mistake. Ben was traveling from Kelowna to Vancouver, and we met up at a bar near his house. We had a few drinks, and he went home for the night. The next day we met up, and his behavior towards me was disrespectful in a passive-aggressive way and extremely creepy. We went to his workplace, and he was very subtly disrespectful to me and his coworkers. He was putting me on the spot and trying to make me look stupid to everyone around. He was a supervisor, so most of the people underneath him were too complacent or afraid to say anything. This man is obviously a psychopath. This is where it got to a point where I believed my life was in danger. We went back to his place, and he was drinking beer, and I was rolling a joint. A movie was playing, and Ben was getting tipsy. He had basically now adopted a speech pattern in our conversation where I felt as though I was being interrogated and toyed with. He was playing a video game on his computer, and I was watching a movie. By this time, I was feeling very uneasy, and my gut instinct was telling me to leave. Generally speaking, you always listen to your gut instinct. That primal thing inside of you linked to fight or flight is best to be obeyed. Now, as the day progressed, and as Ben was becoming drunk, he started saying very weird things. He was mumbling about, "I don't care for anyone but myself. I don't give a crap about people." There was a loaded shotgun beside the table. He looked at his computer screen and started mumbling about being a madman with a gun. A few minutes later, he turned to me and said, "Hey, what if I spiked your drink with something, just to see how you react." He then laughed and added, "Kidding, of course." The cat and mouse game continued. He was now talking about knowing a guy who was HIV positive and how he was going to get the guy to give him an infected needle to infect himself with HIV so he could live on government benefits for the rest of his life. This guy is seriously unhinged. I was sitting there in disbelief at just how vile this guy really was. I wanted to leave, but I also didn't want him to know I was ready to go. It was an awful, vulnerable feeling. He had another beer and turned to me. I was now very uncomfortable. The talk was now about food. He turned to me and looked me straight in the eyes and asked, "So, if this was your last meal, what would you have?" The look on his face was one of stone-faced sincerity and malice. I knew I had to flee. My heart was pounding. I needed to make my move. With adrenaline rushing through my body, I told Ben in a very calm manner that the weed I had was making me feel funny and that I needed a breath of fresh air. I quickly put on my shoes and left before he had any chance to stop me. He made me promise I'd be back. I went down the stairs into the sunlight. I felt like an animal that had just escaped slaughter. The place I was staying at was not too far from Ben's house, and I was wise enough not to tell him where I was staying exactly. I started walking, feeling like I had just escaped certain death. The phone rang. Ben was asking where I was and that he was panicking. I told him I was still taking a breather. Meanwhile, I got to my cousin's house. I somehow managed to get inside. Night had fallen. The guy was calling my phone constantly. When I answered, he was trying to get me to meet up with him and go for a ride. The tone of his voice was flat and fake. He said that we just had a bad night. He was desperately trying to get me to go for a ride with him. I blocked his number. I blocked him on social media. That was the last time I spoke to the jerk. In our many online conversations over the years, Ben would drop clues here and there about his past. That he did horrible things during his supposed gig as a mercenary. He would go on drunken tirades about being a bad man having done bad things. He was going to AA meetings and trying to put on a facade of normality by volunteering at an old folks' home. Deep down, I think he is a psychopath, a potentially dangerous one at that, and I just hope he never murdered anyone other than the 2 people he allegedly shot while on combat duty. Vancouver is a sketchy place full of missing people. I guess we'll never know. Two years ago, I was working for a company as a person who measures houses. Most people haven't heard of it. It's where you essentially have an iPad, and you go to people's homes to draw up floor plans and measure rooms for carpet or hardwood flooring projects. Anyone can request one. I was 25 at the time, one of the few females who worked this position. I was actually really good at the job, so they gave me a lot of work, and I usually hit between 10 to 14 houses a day, driving all over multiple towns. This house was my last house of the day, in the middle of nowhere, and I was exhausted. When I got there, I was incredibly annoyed because the customer wasn't home and was late for his appointment. 10 minutes later, he pulls up next to my car. He was a middle-aged man, balding, wearing normal office attire with a tie and everything. He seemed a bit awkward, but was apologetic and let me into his home. Upon entering, the house was unbelievably spotless and organized. There was minimal furniture, and it smelled like cleaning supplies. It didn't strike me as odd at first. He had 2 cats lounging in the living room. He first started acting weird as I was directed to the first bedroom. He mentioned, "Wow, my cats love you." They don't take to strangers like this usually. But his cats literally didn't move or come near me the whole time. I just nodded and smiled while I got to work scaling out the master bedroom on my iPad. He started inquiring about the electronics I was using. Do they keep track of where you are on that thing? Immediate red flag. Yes. And my boss knows how long each job should take based on the scope of work. It's incredible technology. I lied without missing a beat. He agreed it was amazing. Be careful. Don't touch the gun on the nightstand. It might go off. He chuckled. Talk about immediate spine chill. I looked up from my iPad and sure enough, there was a handgun on the nightstand. I knew instantly that I needed to behave like nothing that was happening was triggering alarms for me. He directed me to the second bedroom, and he said the exact same thing, warning me of a gun on the nightstand that indeed was there. This was the moment I knew I was in danger. At first, I thought it was just my anxiety around guns, but at this point, the tension building between us was undeniable. There were only 2 bedrooms on the scope of work. I hastily met up with him in the kitchen and began running down the next steps. But he interrupted me. Could you measure the basement stairs? I forgot to add them to the list, and I think I might want to carpet them in the future. My heart dropped, but my stupid customer service conditioned brain could not figure out how to get away with saying no. He led me to the basement door, and, you guys, there is no way he was planning on doing anything with these stairs. They were plank wooden stairs, L-shaped, going down to an unfinished basement. Unfortunately, in order to get an accurate measure, I had to walk all the way down them to the basement. Meanwhile, he stood blocking the doorway with a smile on his face, mentioning again whether or not my boss knew where I was, to which I shortly replied yes. Once I got to the basement, I scanned the room quickly. There was not one, but 7 deep freezers lining the walls. In the middle of the room was a lit, low-hanging ceiling light, revealing an old television set, VHS tapes scattered on the floor, and an old recliner facing the TV. Behind this set, 2 white shelves were full of VHS tapes. In this moment, I knew one of 2 things was going to happen. He was either going to let me go, or he was going to push me down the stairs. I held my breath, put a smile on my face in an attempt to act my way out of this situation, and began to climb the stairs. All I could hear was my heartbeat in my ears. He was still blocking the door, no smile this time. As I got to about the 5th stair from the top, I felt him hesitate, which made me hesitate as well. You could cut the tension with a knife, and I finally understood that expression. To my absolute shock and relief, after 4 seconds, he stepped aside. I made a beeline toward the front door, not saying a word, when he stopped me again, saying, "Oh, before you go, won't you give my cats a treat? They love you so much." He was holding a bag of cat treats. I quickly gave his cats a treat, thanked him, and practically ran out of the house, and definitely ran to my car. The second I got out of his driveway, I had the most intense panic attack and cried. I tried to call my boss, but I was in a dead zone. The truth of the matter is that my boss would not have noticed I was missing for at least 24 hours when I didn't route my day the next workday. Yes, he would have eventually been caught as it was my last known location, but I would have been long dead. I suffered PTSD over this experience, and I couldn't sleep for a week. I was petrified to work my job, but had no choice. This day still haunts me. The worst part? I was so messed up, jumbled, and in denial over the experience, I forgot to write down his address. I have never felt fear like this, ever. Really creepy encounter. So I work in the service industry, beauty, body, etc. A few years ago, there was a very strange, very creepy client we had who came in for a series of treatments, which meant I, and 3 other girls, would see him several times a week. He would come for the latest appointment possible, bring weird books about lucid dreaming, and strip down to absolutely nothing but a towel over his junk, even though his treatment did not require him being nude. We all agreed he was a complete weirdo, and after a few weeks, we were free from his crazy behavior. Fast forward to this past winter. He calls out of the blue, says he wants to start these treatments again. I begged my boss not to have him come in, but there wasn't really a reason not to have him. Plus he's in his early 20s, a rich kid who will spend all of his mom's money. As he was speaking to me over the phone, he remembered everything about me and began apologizing for being rude to me in the past, which he wasn't, just a freak, and said he had a huge crush on me, blah blah blah. The first few treatments, my coworker would be with me, but after a few weeks, she couldn't work that late anymore, so I was alone. He constantly tried to keep me in the room with him, first asking questions about the treatment, but then trying to pry into my personal life. He kept complimenting my body and looks, to which I would politely say that wasn't appropriate, and he would apologize. On more than one occasion, he was definitely under the influence of substances, and not on weed, and would say the weirdest things. This all doesn't sound too bad, but if you could picture what a serial killer would behave like, from movies and TV, that was this guy. I'm not even joking. He was the scariest person I've ever met in my whole life. The day I finally had enough was when he came in wearing a suit. During the treatment, he complimented me over and over, and then began asking me how I felt about women being assaulted and murder, and saying women were horrible and such. I became increasingly nervous, and he would laugh or try and contain his laughter while talking about assault and murder. I can't even remember what he said because I was so scared I blanked everything. After his treatment was done, I immediately called him a cab. He would usually ask me to do it, but I did it way earlier than he would ever ask me. And just before he left, he said, "I find it adorable that you're so vulnerable," and stood there staring at me with honestly the coldest look in his eyes, and a slight smirk. I literally almost bawled my eyes out right in front of him. I could feel my heart racing, and I was sweating profusely. Before he left, he said he forgot something in the room and stood there waiting for me to get it for him. If I had gone into that room, he could easily have followed behind me and blocked the doorway. I could have easily been trapped in there after 8 p.m. in the winter when it's very dark out. The streets around here are dead at that time, and the other tenants in this building always leave around 5 or 6. He just stood staring at me, and I sat at my desk, literally clutching a pair of scissors away from his view, waiting for him to go in and get whatever it was he forgot. He grabbed the item, then asked me to help clean up, to which I obviously said no, and locked the door as he was gone. I watched him get into his cab, and then ran to my car, literally crying the hardest I've ever cried in my adult life. He called for several days and tried to explain to my coworker that he thought he scared me and wanted to apologize. I never spoke to him and told my boss what happened, to which she banned him from returning. I don't know if he would have actually attempted anything, but I think the fact that I called the cab earlier without him asking, he knew someone would have been outside. Maybe that deterred him. This story happened more than 10 years ago when I was still a student. It contains some graphic details of animal harm and violence, so discretion is advised. A bit of backstory. Like most students, I was always broke and had a few ventures, apart from my part-time job, to bring in extra money. One of them was house and pet sitting. I've always had a love for animals, so when this couple contacted me to house sit for them for the last few days of their overseas trip, since their previous sitter had bailed and their 6-month-old golden retriever puppy would be alone, I jumped at the opportunity. The fact that they promised to pay me the full 2-week fee for staying less than a week made it even more appealing. Little did I know how bad it would turn out. I got the details, collected the keys from the agent, and headed to the house. As it was already after 5 p.m. and almost dark, it was early spring. The house was really nice, but bordered a not-so-great area known for crime, including break-ins and robberies. It didn't bother me much because, nothing will happen to me. I know, young and naive. The first 4 nights went by without a hitch. I spent my time watching movies, enjoying the jacuzzi, and generally relaxing. The owners were scheduled to return late on the 5th day. That evening, I went to check on the dog. Around 10 p.m., they called to inform me that their flight was delayed and they'd be staying in a hotel before making the 3.5-hour drive back the following morning. They asked if I could stay there another night. That was fine, as I was already there and still had my overnight bag in the car. I called my dad to let him know of the change in plans since I was still living with my parents at the time. He specifically asked for the address, which I normally wouldn't share because I felt old enough to handle things on my own. To this day, I believe that decision saved my life. I eventually went to bed around 1 a.m., but it felt like I'd only slept for 5 minutes when I was jolted awake by the sound of breaking glass. I could hear movement and what sounded like footsteps running down the hallway. The first thing I did was grab my phone and hit redial. Thanks to my old Motorola, redialing was as simple as pressing one button. My dad was the last person I'd called, so I hoped he'd wake up from the call. I dropped the phone between the headboard and mattress, just in case he picked up and could hear what was happening. Barely a moment later, the first intruder stormed through the bedroom door. I could see his silhouette and the knife in his hand. When he saw me, he raised it and came at me. For those unfamiliar with South Africa's crime, robberies and home invasions are often brutally violent. Victims are frequently harmed or worse, even if they cooperate. Instinctively, I pulled my legs back. When the intruder got close enough, I kicked out with all my strength. At 6 feet 3 inches and about 220 pounds of fit muscle, I had spent a lot of time at the gym. My kick sent the man flying into the wall, and the knife fell from his hand. Before he could recover, I was on top of him, slamming my right knee into his face and his head into the wall. Knowing my life depended on it, I didn't hold back. He collapsed like a sack of potatoes. Before I could react further, I heard the distinct sound of a pistol cocking. I froze. It felt like all the blood drained from my body. The only thought running through my head was that if he shot me, I'd rather die than live disabled or dependent on others. The second man stood there, pointing the pistol at my head for what felt like hours, though it was likely only a few seconds. Finally, in broken English, he ordered me to get on the bed, face down. Terrified, I complied, reasoning that if he wanted to shoot me, he already would have. He threw a blanket over me, and I curled into a fetal position with my back against the wall, hoping that if they tried to stab me, I could use my arms and legs to protect my torso. Now, by that time, I had forgotten that I had called my dad, and the guy I had knee was still down. I heard a third person enter the room, and it sounded like they were speaking Portuguese. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but I recognized the language, as we used to go to Mozambique on holiday often, where it's the main language spoken. One of them tried to help the guy I knocked down off the ground, while another started ransacking the house, shoving valuables into a big bag. At this point, I heard tires screeching and a car approaching at what felt like Mach 1. The car skidded to a halt right in front of the gate, and I heard someone scream. It was my dad. The 3 men inside the house panicked, ran out the back door, and tried to jump the fence. My dad opened fire, shooting in their general direction. Now, I know my dad missed on purpose because, if he wanted to hit them, he would have. He's the best shot I know, and I'm not just saying that because he's my dad. He's ex-Army Special Forces, or Recce's, for those in the know, has represented SA in the Clay Pigeon World Championships, and has won various regional pistol and rifle championships. He's also a gunsmith by trade. I've seen him hit golf balls at 50 meters with his pistol. Politics and the racial situation in the country would have put him in serious trouble if he had hit any of them. I grabbed the house keys, pressed the gate remote, and my dad called the police while coming inside. I met him at the front door, and we walked out to the car to wait for the police. It took them over an hour to arrive, citing some excuse about no vehicles being available. By that time, I had calmed down and started looking for the dog. I couldn't find her anywhere. I grabbed a flashlight from my dad and scanned the yard. When I reached the corner, I saw her lying on the ground. She was dead. Later, autopsies revealed she had been poisoned. The police found pieces of meat laced with poison near the fence. Poisoning is a common practice in my country when targeting a house for a break-in or robbery. I was fuming and heartbroken. The police were also unhelpful, with a don't-care attitude, barely taking our statements. By the time it started getting light, I retrieved my bag, phone, and locked the house as best as I could without touching anything. I then drove home behind my dad. Once home, I got the story from his side. He said he answered my call only to hear shouting and what sounded like fighting. When I didn't respond, he raced over. Luckily, I had given him the address the night before, and he knew the area well. My dad's house is about 6 miles away, through a residential area, typically a 20-minute drive. The call lasted 7 minutes and 13 seconds. Later that day, I met the detective, gave my statement, and they took fingerprints. The owners of the house returned around the same time. The rest of the day was a blur as the shock and adrenaline wore off. That's not where the story ends. About 7 or 8 months later, I got a call from the detective saying they caught the suspects and asked me to attend a lineup. I told her I didn't see their faces because it was dark, and after the gun was held against my head, I was under a blanket. She assured me they'd been caught through fingerprints and would show them to me beforehand. At the station, it wasn't like in the movies. There was no one-way glass or separate room. The 3 men were brought into the room and made to stand against a wall. The leader, the one I had met, looked at me with unimaginable hate. His name was Joseph Dragon Sambo. He raised his hand to his neck and made a throat-slitting gesture. We left the room, and the detective gave me a copy of his criminal record. It listed 4 counts of murder, 8 or 9 attempted murders, multiple assaults, aggravated assaults, over 100 house break-ins and robberies, and other crimes. I was shocked. The detective told me that if I hadn't acted quickly that night, I wouldn't have gotten away as lightly. 3 days later, the detective called again to warn me that Joseph had escaped custody and hadn't been recaptured. I wasn't too worried since the robbery wasn't at my house. I had changed cars, and I now carried a licensed pistol with me 24/7. 2 years later, I ran into the detective at a grocery store. She told me Joseph had been killed during a home invasion. He had broken into the wrong house, and the owner, armed with a pistol, shot him in the stomach and neck. Emergency services and police responded too slowly, and he bled out on the floor. All 3 suspects were undocumented Mozambican nationals. The lack of proper identification makes it easy for individuals to commit crimes and evade capture by fleeing back across the border. This ordeal has made me more vigilant and heightened my situational awareness. While I've avoided dangerous situations because of it, it has also cost me my peace of mind. To Joseph and anyone considering similar actions, if you come for me, I'll ensure your swift departure from this world. More than a few years ago, I was working as a burlesque entertainer in a gentleman's club and was idly sitting at the end of the bar one night when a couple came in, not unusual. I had no contact with them and thought nothing of their being there until later. A few days after that night, the doorman handed me a piece of paper that had 2 names and phone numbers written on it, Laura and Richard. I was supposed to call one of them, so I called Laura, who told me they had been the couple who'd been at the bar the other night. They noticed me and thought I'd be perfect for a part in a movie Richard was producing. Would I be up for a meeting? Of course, I would. Who wouldn't? I was told Richard would pick me up the next night at 7 and to wear something wild. 7 o'clock came the next evening, and I was ready in a white lace dress with ostrich feather trim when Richard showed up outside my building. So, I went down, introduced myself, and got in the car. We agreed to go to a local bar I knew well for the meeting, but first, we had to go back to his place so he could pick up some contracts he'd forgotten. So off we went. He went into the house and came back out with a few manila envelopes and an open bottle of beer, a brand that I didn't drink. Plus, it's against the law to drink alcohol in a vehicle here, so I stuck the beer into the window well of his Jeep, and we went to the bar. At the bar, he showed me what were supposedly scripts from this movie he was producing and some contracts, and it looked pretty legit. Richard was very nice, and I was interested. I'd made some plans to go out later with my soon-to-be boyfriend, so I excused myself to go call him on the bar's payphone and took my Corona that I'd ordered at the bar with me to the bank of phones. As a dancer, I'd been taught by the other older girls to never let your drink out of your sight. My boyfriend wanted to get going to another club, so I went back to the table where Richard was and told him I had to go. He didn't like that and tried a few different things to get me to go to the movie set with him, saying I could meet Mickey Rourke and check out the set. But all I really wanted to do was meet my boyfriend, so I declined, took Richard's card, and left. I never heard from Richard again, but a couple of months later, the police came around to the bar I was working at. They had 2 big books of mugshots and a stack of Polaroids with them, and they wanted to talk to all of us about a predator couple who had been setting up meetings with dancers by saying they were in the film industry, then drugging and attacking them. They showed me the 2 mugshot books and asked if I saw anyone I recognized in the pictures, and I immediately identified Richard and Laura. Then they showed me the Polaroids, which were trophy pictures of the couple in the act of attacking the poor drugged girls, and asked if I knew any of the victims and where they might find them to talk to the girls. I only knew a couple of the women in the photographs, but there were a lot that this had happened to. Richard and Laura were prosecuted. He went to jail, but she didn't, because she was from a wealthy family and also turned witness on him. About 12 years after Richard was convicted, I saw in the newspaper that he was up for the possibility of parole. So, I wrote a letter to the parole board telling this story and urging them to not let him back out because he's a dangerous offender who should have to stay in prison for the entirety of his sentence. If I had drunk that open beer he had handed me in his Jeep on the way to that meeting, I wouldn't have made it to the meeting and would probably have ended up in that stack of Polaroids. Girls and guys, always keep your eye on your drinks. Have fun, but be careful out there. What I am about to describe will sound like a cheap cliché movie script, but this did indeed happen. Even at home, barely anybody believes me without confirmation from the other parties involved. It was autumn 2019 in British Columbia, Canada. I am from Germany but spent half a year in Canada as part of my bachelor's degree. I barely got back before COVID hit. I was 22 years old at the time, and the other people involved were about the same age. Another foreign student and I befriended this local Canadian student. We all had the same interests and humor, and the dude became a very good friend of ours. He told us all about the local area, and we spent a week in the summer with him and his father at their very remote, remember this, cabin near some woods. They taught us how to handle guns there and let us shoot a lot. Ammo is expensive as heck. Then fall came, and we had a lot of free time due to being finished with all our papers. So our buddy proposed that we spend a few days at his dad's cabin, this time without his father. We said, hell yeah, because we could load up on booze and substances and have a great time there, just living the life. 3 close dudes in the woods, gaming and getting wasted. Sounds great, right? After loading up on all the supplies, the first 3 days were very calm. On the first day, just like the last time I was there, I barely slept and was generally tense. This is because I am naturally a very paranoid guy, and I often go into alert mode in situations, which is often mocked by my friends. In this case, What freaked me out the most was the fact that we were far away from civilization. And you never understand how quiet your surroundings can be until you spend some time in a remote area like this, which led to me often just standing in the dark at night, listening to the surroundings of the cabin. But after the first few days, I got less paranoid. After all, I was with friends, constantly high, and we were quite armed and dangerous, probably most dangerous to ourselves, though. Day 4 came. We spent the day attempting to hunt in the woods, mostly just chilling under trees with a beer and rifle in hand. But in the evening, it started to rain heavily. After an hour, we began to see lightning in the distance, with quite a bit of time passing between lightning and thunder, which meant the thunderstorm itself was still some time away. So we aborted our incompetent hunting attempts and started trekking back to the cabin. It took us about an hour to reach it due to it already being very dark and the rain creating unsafe footing. For context, you should know that once you spend a few days in the wilderness and haven't seen a soul other than your friends for days, you can become quite careless about your surroundings. I think you can imagine why I'm telling you that last part. So, we entered the cabin. At that time, the thunderstorm was raging full on. We put away our gear and changed clothes, except for our guns. Yeah, I know, substances and guns are a horrible combination, and I wouldn't mix that stuff nowadays, but we were drilled quite well by our Canadian friend's dad regarding trigger discipline, safety, etc. And man, I really miss spooning a rifle while sleeping. We cozied up in the living room at a table, started a YouTube video, and began playing cards. Barely 20 minutes passed since we returned. At the time, we didn't bother closing the curtains in the living room because thunderstorms are baller as heck. So imagine that we were 3 guys, sitting around a table, occasionally in awe at the weather outside while playing cards. In such a remote place, it is extremely dark outside. Without a full moon and clear skies, it is pitch black. The only lamps we had were old vintage ones and dimmer than my phone's screen. What comes next is how my also non-local friend described what he saw. While sipping from his beer, another lightning bolt went off. He spit it out instantly after the lightning struck, screamed loudly, and stood up. No words, just the sound of panic. My Canadian friend and I were instantly perplexed and looked at him. There is somebody outside. He started rambling about how, in that split second, the lightning illuminated the outside of the cabin, and he saw a person standing a bit of distance away from the cabin, looking directly at us. Now this is what I meant when I said cliché horror story. Barely anybody believes me at first, but this did happen. My non-local friend was obviously in full-on panic. His face looked anxious. This communicated to our Canadian buddy and me that this guy wasn't just messing with us. He did see somebody outside. I grabbed my rifle and pulled the bolt to rack around into the chamber. I felt that warm sensation running down my spine, the adrenaline releasing in my body. I tried to stay far away from the window, staring into the darkness outside, but I couldn't see anything. While our Canadian friend rushed into his room to grab his pistol, I started panicking even more because I realized we hadn't locked the door. Why would we? We hadn't seen anyone in days and were in the middle of the wilderness. So, I ran to the door and locked it. Our friend returned with his pistol, which he grabbed because it had a flashlight attached. He carefully approached the window, then changed his pace from sneaky to fast and pushed the window open with one hand while the other hand aimed the handgun outside. I wish I was any good at drawing because what we saw next, when our friend turned on the flashlight, was the most terrifying image I have ever seen. It is burned into my mind. The fact that I cannot share that image with other people has been bugging me for 3 years now. The light turned on. What we saw in that moment was a man, tall and slim, dressed in all black, with a hooded raincoat pulled over his head, almost covering his eyes. He was not far from the cabin, just a few steps away from the window. But he wasn't standing, as our friend yelled earlier. He was crouching, looking directly at us with clenched eyes and a terrifying little smirk on one side of his mouth. Another lightning flash lit up the area, and for that moment, we were all frozen. The image of what we saw must have shocked the other guys as much as it did me, because nobody said anything for a few seconds. There is a hard-to-explain, dreadful feeling about seeing something like this. In a storm, in the middle of nowhere, a person dressed in a black raincoat suddenly crouching so close to you and facing you. Our Canadian buddy aimed his pistol with an attached flashlight at the frozen, crouched, smirking man and yelled out, with a slight stutter in a higher-pitched voice than I had ever heard from him, "Get away from us, or we will shoot." At that moment, after his eyes adjusted, the raincoat man seemed to realize that this was not just a flashlight, but a gun. I was standing next to my friend with a hunting rifle in my arms. The raincoat man's slight smirk shifted into an expression I couldn't quite read, shock or rage. All of this happened in less than a minute. While my friend kept yelling and I was frozen, the raincoat figure turned about 90 degrees toward the nearest tree line and quickly transitioned from a crouch to a full sprint. He ran away to the right side of our window. Two of us poked our heads out the window to see where he was going, but with the heavy rainfall and darkness, we could barely make out anything near the tree line. After a few minutes of just looking at each other in disbelief, we decided to fire a few rounds out of the window to prove we were serious and to cope. When the shock wore off, we decided to call the police. They asked many questions over the phone to pinpoint the cabin's location and for a description of the man who had crept up on us, totally unsuspected and only revealed due to the lightning and sheer luck. Due to being in such a remote area, the cops told us it would take at least 1 or 2 hours for someone to reach us. They asked, because of the weather and time, if it would be alright to send someone the next day to discuss the details. Given that the man saw we were armed, he probably wouldn't come back. We agreed. We discussed jumping in the truck and leaving right then, but we had been too lazy to refuel earlier. The idea of doing this in the dark, in that heavy rain, was just too frightening. I kept imagining that man lurking in the darkness, picking us off one by one. We spent the night sleeping in shifts. One person stood guard while the others at least attempted to sleep. When it was my turn, the rain had died down. I turned off all the lights, opened a window, and sat in the darkness, listening for any sounds and scanning the area. Let me tell you, sitting in the dark for hours on high alert gives you a lot of time to think and replay what just happened. By midday the next day, 2 cops arrived. We gave them a detailed account of what happened and showed them the direction the raincoat figure had run. They said they would organize a patrol to comb the woods, but it might take a while as they needed experienced outdoorsmen. Unfortunately, we hadn't seen enough of the man's face to describe his age, only that he was tall and clean-shaven. The chances of finding him and understanding what he intended to do were slim. However, one of the officers expressed deep concern about the incident. We left the cabin a few hours after the police did, and our Canadian friend's dad insisted we stay at his house for at least a day until we felt safe. He also wanted to hear every detail and decided it was time to install cameras around the cabin. Later, I heard that the dad and his brother went back to the cabin and waited in the dark, hoping the raincoat man would return. As far as I know, they never saw him again, so he might have moved on to another area. I never heard back from the cops. The following January, I left Canada and returned home. A few months later, my Canadian friend was called in for an interview, suggesting the police were still actively investigating. The image of that crouched raincoat figure, completely soaked, surrounded by darkness, and so close to our cabin, is burned into my memory. I will most likely never forget it. Even now, I sometimes turn off all the lights and look out the windows in silence, trying to listen for sounds. Although I am on the other side of the world, that moment haunts me. We've speculated a lot about what that man was doing. The most likely theory is that his intentions were sinister. This didn't look like a simple burglary attempt. He could see we were inside the cabin, and yet he crept closer in a raincoat during a thunderstorm. When my friend yelled out, he crouched and moved closer to the window. I suspect the raincoat man was scoping out his potential victims. I don't even want to imagine what might have happened if we were two unarmed women in that cabin in the middle of nowhere. We didn't see any headlights passing through the clearing. The man didn't have a backpack, just a raincoat and black, weather-appropriate clothing. I would bet everything that this man had a plan and knew exactly what he was doing. As I write this, I keep wondering about the logistics. The man must have had a camp or a car hidden in the woods. He couldn't sustain himself out there otherwise. He might have stumbled upon the cabin during the storm or spotted us earlier when we were hunting. In pitch darkness, a flashlight must have been as obvious as a beacon, so he might have tracked us to the cabin. If anyone has heard of similar incidents near Vancouver, British Columbia, please let me know. This mystery grips me to this day. I still sometimes dream of that raincoat figure creeping closer with each flash of lightning. I'm a 19-year-old woman living in the Pacific Northwest. A couple of months ago, I was looking for extra work because my hours at my regular job were terrible. I'm quiet, anxious, and don't have any friends, so I turned to Craigslist. I knew the site could be sketchy, but I was desperate for side gigs and hadn't had any luck as someone with no skills and unwilling to do adult work. One ad caught my attention. It offered $50 for someone to take photos of a property using either a camera or something above an iPhone 12. I have an iPhone 14, promising it would only take an hour or two. I emailed the poster and soon got a text back. The man said I seemed like the perfect fit and invited me over that same day. What's funny is, I actually made a post on the subreddit, too afraid to ask, asking if it was a dumb idea. Everyone told me to take someone with me. I didn't, and I deleted the post shortly after. The house was about 20 minutes outside of town, surrounded by dense forest. It was small and run down, but nothing that raised alarms. The man who greeted me looked like he was in his 50s, unremarkable. He invited me inside. The house was completely empty, no furniture, just dust and dirt. I asked where to start taking photos, but he kept dodging the question, making small talk and asking personal questions about me instead. My anxiety was building, so I kept the small talk going. Then he began staring at me intensely. At one point, I dropped my phone. When he picked it up, he held onto it a little too long before handing it back. When we were taking photos of the master bedroom, he brushed my face with his hand and complimented my skin. I knew it was stupid to come here, but at that moment, my blood truly ran cold. I was done making excuses in my head. I made a quick excuse to leave, something about my mom, but when I turned toward the door, he grabbed my arm. I still have the picture I took after the ordeal of the bruises on my forearm. It felt like it was going to get snapped in half. I had brought a small knife for self-defense, a gift from my paranoid mom who would have never let me come here if she had known. Without thinking, I pulled it out and stabbed him in the arm. It was released with the push of a small button. He let go, swinging at my arm, but I was already running out of the house. I got into my car and drove until I reached a gas station and finally felt calm. I called the police and explained everything. They took it seriously. I came in to make a report and answer questions. They searched the property and the surrounding forest but didn't find him. The house turned out to be abandoned, and in the basement they found a pack of zip ties. A report was made, but he's still out there. I call sometimes for updates, but it's never anything of substance. I've never told anyone about this other than the police, not even my mom. I know typing this I sound pretty unbothered, but this is the first time anything like that has ever happened to me. I have trouble leaving my house most days. I decided to type this out here as a way to get it off my chest because it plagues my thoughts constantly. It was the summer of 2015 when I moved in, and at first glance, my housemate/landlord Mike seemed somewhat normal, if not a bit socially awkward and dysfunctional. When I was signing the papers, he was adamant that I should never go into the basement, which I thought was odd. But I really needed a place to stay, and well, people have their little quirks, so I just chalked it up to that at the time. As I got to know Mike and our cohabitation continued, I learned more about the depths of his dysfunction. Firstly, that he used substances. Now, I don't automatically judge people based on vices, but I was surprised at the extent of his use. He was probably the first person I knew who used substances and balanced a full-time job, enjoying a decent amount of success. The reason this is important to the story is that when he would be around the house, drinking and using substances, he would start to run off at the mouth. He would often joke that if I smelled like coming from the basement, not to think anything of it. I think it was probably the third time he said this that I asked why he kept saying that, and he said, "I use chemicals to clean up after the bodies," with a wily grin on his face. I tried to chalk that up to a bad sense of humor, but it didn't sit right with me. He was also very particular that I let him know of my comings and goings and my work schedule. I remember him being shocked and uncomfortable one day that I ended up taking off work because he didn't realize that I was home. I remember that day because there was a lot of clanging and what sounded like muffled shouting coming from the basement. His car was in the driveway, but he was not in the main house or his bedroom. Other days, he would play very loud music that bumped through the whole house. Sometimes, he would even play NPR talk radio at those volumes. In retrospect, I think he may have been trying to mask sounds. He would make remarks about sex workers, saying, "You can do whatever you want, you can choke them or beat them to death, and nobody cares." I took exception to this. I told him I thought that was messed up. But when he would get tweaking, he'd always come back around to alluding to the same kind of violence, talking about how he was a normal white guy who owned a house and had a good career, so the police would never suspect him. At this point, I started to think that it had gone too far to simply be a joke. I was in a weird position because money was tight at the time and my options were few. I tried to convince myself that even if he is messed up, he is probably just engaging in outward fantasism. I knew that he would acquire the services of sex workers on occasion, but again, did not judge that activity at face value, though I started becoming concerned. Then, at one point while I was doing laundry, I caught whiffs of decomposition. The house we were in was in southeast Portland, and it was relatively new. Having grown up in upstate New York, I know that animals can be trapped in walls and die, but this was the garage, and there were no animals scurrying in the walls. This was strange and telling to me. I considered carefully what I would do and decided I would confront him about the smell. I decided to pose the question in a somewhat suggestive way by expanding on his jokes. I told him that he needed to do a better job cleaning up the bodies because I smelled decomposition from the garage. I will never forget his reaction. His eyes widened, and he shot me a sharp glare, somewhere between fear and anger. He stumbled over his words and eventually responded, "What? Really?" I said, "Yes, really." There were a few seconds of awkwardness before he said, "Thanks for letting me know," and promptly went into his bedroom and shut the door. A few days after that, he went into the upper crawl space in the garage while I was again doing laundry. He called for me and was trying to convince me to come up into the crawl space. My body locked up, and it was like my instincts were screaming at me that if I went up there, I would not come back down. I gave some excuse that I can sparsely remember that I had to be someplace, packed up my laundry, threw it in my room, and left. He spent a lot of time in the padlocked basement without a doorknob. The only way in was through the backyard. I wish I would have gone down there in retrospect to either confirm or dismiss the suspicions once and for all. In the last couple of months I lived there, I was privy to more graphic comments about women and sex workers, explicit talk of sexual violence, and he was using more and more substances. He once showed me a video he made. He is a graphic designer and artist as well, which featured heavy bondage themes, interspersed with distorted audio of women screaming, and this strange leering figure in a plague doctor costume. It was one of those situations where any one of these things alone may have been innocuous, but as they accumulated, it became suspicious to me. It was October of 2016 that I left there, taking off to a CEOA camp during the anti-pipeline protests with the Standing Rock Lakota. A mix of feeling called to action and having nothing to lose, as I wanted to get out of that house in the worst way. My last night there, I did not give notice that I was leaving. He was drinking and tweaking again, started in on the same conversation, loosely describing murder and sexual violence in the tone of some sort of edgy joke. I told him he would be caught eventually, not even holding back my suspicion anymore. He reiterated that he was the last person police would suspect and asserted that they wouldn't catch him. He said this in a very serious and concise way, dropping the pretense he had been using before. I left the next morning. This haunted me for months, then a year and a half. I felt as though I hadn't done anything. The guilt was eating away at me, so I called Portland Crime Stoppers and put in an anonymous tip describing what I had described here. When I did, the operator started going back and forth, putting me on hold because the call had piqued the interest of the police sergeant who was assigned to the call center. They were asking me detailed questions about his vehicle, his house, the methods he described, etc. It seemed like they took interest. I gave them as much information as I could remember and left it at that, feeling just a little better that I had at least tried to do something about it. Fast forward to recent times, I told my mother about all of this, and she became interested, asking what house this was. She ended up pulling it up on Google Maps, put up the street view, and I noticed that there was a large, enclosed trailer in the driveway that wasn't there when I was. I could theorize why it might have been there, but cannot put together a practical reason for it, or why he'd be using it, unless he was moving or using it to haul things to discard. Admittedly, that is pure conjecture, but I couldn't help but wonder. I doubt that I will get closure or have my suspicions validated unless he does finally get caught and arrested, and I read about it. I have grown up poor and been around the lowlife a lot. I have interacted with many sketchy and unsavory people in my time, but none of them have ever made the impression that Mike made on me. Make of it what you will, but I hope I never meet him again. I've never felt so terrified of someone I once called a friend in my life. I once met up with an old friend of mine, M22, a friend I had known for a few years prior to the meetup in November 2017. I had actually met this person on a dating site. However, as time went on, the relationship between us became strictly platonic. There were no red flags. My gut did not warn me, so I completely trusted this person. We met up in town, behind a bus station, on a grassy hill surrounded by trees and a tall wall. Our meeting was just to have a smoke, get a little high, and have a small catch-up. The meetup was fine. I had actually started smoking weed a few months before, so I was still relatively new to it. He had brought something new for me to try, purple haze. I wasn't at all anxious about trying it, as I completely trusted this person and would never believe that he would lie to me. He had packed a full blunt for me, but I only managed to smoke a quarter of the blunt. We spoke during this time about work, our previous relationships, and random stuff. About half an hour later, I started to feel extremely lightheaded and anxious. I suddenly had this strange feeling where I did not feel comfortable at all, and I really wanted to go home. When I asked him if I could go home, he offered to take me home, but I said, "No, it's okay." He offered again, "Please let me take you home. You'll be safe with me. I wouldn't hurt you." I shook my head and said, "No, thank you. I can take myself home." When I started to walk away, I felt like I was walking on a cloud. My head became dizzy, and my eyesight was a little blurry. I had never felt like this before, and in time, I started to panic. When we made our way down the hill toward the bus station, I was relieved, as there were a lot of people around, so if anything happened, someone would step in. I became extremely terrified of him. I had this horrible feeling in my gut that told me to get away from him, and when I got to the bus station, I told him I would call my taxi here and go home. His tone was no longer nice, but very stern. "I'm gonna take you home now," and he began to pull at my jacket. I told him no, and that I was going home on my own. He pulled my jacket harder, and I fell against him. He pulled me into him and told me I didn't need to be scared of him. But I was so terrified. At this point, I started to feel very paranoid, and I couldn't see properly. I pushed him away from me and rubbed my eyes, then called for a taxi. He tried to pull my phone from me and yelled in my face, "Do you ever listen? I'm taking you home." I noticed a few people had stopped and asked if I was okay. All I remember was that I wanted to go home. So, a lady kindly called a taxi for me and waited with me. She made sure I was okay and helped me into the taxi. During the time when I waited for the taxi, he kept trying to get me to come to his car with him, but the lady that looked after me told him to go home and that she was going to take me home instead. So, he left. When I got home, I gave the taxi driver money and told him to keep the change. I didn't want to wait around. I just wanted to get into my bed because, at that time, it was the only place I would feel and be safe from harm. That evening, I lay in my bed for 5 hours straight, staring at the ceiling. I don't remember if I thought about anything or if my mom came at any time. I just remember lying in bed doing nothing until the paranoia and the sickly feeling began to wear off. I remember looking at my phone and seeing I had 32 missed calls from him, 10 voicemails left, and 50 plus messages. The messages were weird. He had sent around 20 messages just asking where I was and when I got home. And in one of the voicemails, he had told me how he had this fantasy of taking me home while drugged up and tying me up. He wanted to blindfold me and wanted me to submit myself to him. I freaked out and blocked him on all social media, Instagram, Snapchat, Discord, and I blocked his number. Before the blocking, I told him if he ever contacted me again, then I would call the police. I heard nothing from him for a month until I received a text from an unknown number asking me how I was. I hadn't given my number to anyone, so I ignored it. I then received another message a few minutes later saying they missed me and that they would see me soon. I asked who they were. No reply. Nothing. I've spoken to some friends about my story, and all of them have explained that weed would never make anyone feel this way, and a lot of them think I was given spice, not weed. Spice looks a lot like weed, but the effects are a lot stronger and more dangerous. True crime was and is one of my favorite genres of entertainment. I love reading about serial killers, stalkers, and things like that because none of it had ever touched my life personally. But since this happened, it's become much less rooted in fantasy, and I'm looking out for red flags. During my sophomore year in college, I was a volunteer teaching assistant for an on-campus international student program in the Northeast. Basically, it was the last step students had to take to get a certificate telling potential schools and employers, "I can speak English really well, and here's proof." The students tended to come in groups selected by programs in their home countries. So one semester, we might have a lot of Chinese and Brazilian students, and the next, we'd have Koreans and Saudi Arabians. This particular semester, there were a lot of people from Mexico, and they all lived in an off-campus housing complex called the Suites. Now, my position, as I've said, was volunteer. I'd had some friends from the program in the past, and they knew I wanted to teach English abroad, so they put in a good word for me with the staff so I could get some practical skills and experience under my belt. Being as informal an arrangement as it was, I had no qualms about forming personal relationships with the students. In fact, a few of us are still good friends today. I wasn't a very outgoing person at the time, and though I had many friends, I hardly ever drank and had never been to a party. Hearing this, the Mexican students, who threw parties every weekend, insisted that I come to the next one. The party was fun. It comprised, almost exclusively international students, which was nice because I knew most of them. I got really drunk and had fluent conversations in languages I had very loose grasps on. Everything was going great until a few of us retreated into a friend's dorm for some air. Checking their phones, a few girls realized that Pamela had not returned from Main Street yet and no one could get a hold of her. Pamela was a 19-year-old Mexican student and had gone to a local eatery after lessons that day in order to meet one of the teachers for a private tutoring session. The session was scheduled for 5 p.m. and should not have gone longer than 7:30. It was 11:30 at this point, and the girls were understandably worried. I asked which teacher the tutoring session was with, and they told me it was Charles. Immediately my skin crawled. There were about 5 teachers at the facility, and Charles was by far the sketchiest. He was around 40 years old, half Japanese American, with short but visibly flat-ironed black hair that partially covered his glasses. He honestly looked like a stereotypical weirdo. I tried to hop around between classrooms on a weekly basis to get a feel for different teaching methods, but I cut my week with Charles short because he was just so creepy. The way he spoke to his students was condescending and mildly inappropriate, commenting on a girl's blouse or telling risque stories about his own wild college years and how they ought to take a page from his book, all this in the middle of class, mind you. Additionally, he would always get uncomfortably close to Latina students, grabbing their shoulders, touching the smalls of their backs, and even grazing their breasts occasionally. He creeped me, and everyone else, the heck out. After sharing some creepy Charles stories, we were all freaked out and ready to do something. Last anyone had heard from Pam was at 5:15 when she texted and said her phone was going to die, but she would figure out a way home when the tutoring was finished. It was the middle of winter in the northeastern U.S., and a blizzard warning was in effect. The diner she was at was a 3-mile walk from the suites, and a few girls suggested she was bunkering down until the warning let up. The problem was, that could be days. Another theory was that she got lost trying to find her way home in the snow. None of us had a car, so we told a few of the boys, and they formed a search party and started walking toward Main Street. Just a few minutes later, they returned with a snow-covered Pamela in their midst. Being from Mexico, none of these people had properly packed for a brutal winter, so when they found her, she was freezing and soaked to the bone. After a hot shower and relaxing for a bit, she told us, in Spanish, what happened. When she arrived at the diner, Charles was nowhere to be found. She waited for 40 minutes and was just about to start walking back, knowing a storm was coming, when he finally showed up. He apologized and said he had been upstairs and had dozed off. He lived in the upstairs apartment, you see, and asked if she wouldn't mind taking the lesson up there, where it was quieter. Being a shy, somewhat reserved person who spoke little English, she complied. When they got upstairs, he started asking her all sorts of questions about herself, most of which she could barely answer, and when she stumbled, he would laugh and chastise her for her mistakes. He tutored her for about an hour and then made them both dinner. It was 7 p.m. by now, and Pam wanted to leave, but he told her to eat, and then he would drive her home afterward. It was pitch dark, and the storm was picking up considerably. A girl like you shouldn't be walking home alone at night, he told her. Pam was nervous, but she knew he was right, and she wasn't confident she'd even be able to find her way home in all this snow, so she stayed. When they finished eating, Pamela went for the door, but he stopped her and asked if she would do him a favor. He went into his bedroom and beckoned for her to follow. Hesitant as she was, she peeked into the room and saw a full photo studio set up against the wall facing the bed. He told her to stand in front of the lights so he could take a few photos and then he'd take her home. Frightened and confused in a country she was unfamiliar with a man she thought she could trust, she did as she was told. After a few minutes, the requests got darker. He showed her pictures of other girls, mostly college-aged Latinas, who he had taken pictures of in various positions and states of undress, and asked her if she would do some of those poses. She said no, she didn't want to undress, so he pulled a pair of boxer shorts and a tank top out of his top drawer and tossed them at her. Put these on, then. Just a few pictures and then we'll go, I promise. She went into the bathroom to change into the clothes he'd given her and just sat there, cursing at her dead phone on the brink of tears. For 5, 10, 15 minutes, she couldn't remember how long she sat there until he started knocking on the door. Pamela, come on, I was just kidding. Come out of there, I'll take you home now. Not completely trusting him, but knowing there was no other way out of this situation, she exited the bathroom. He apologized for making her feel uncomfortable and offered to drive her home, at which point she grabbed her things, said she was fine walking, and left. He didn't go after her. He didn't try to stop her. She did, in fact, end up getting lost and walking around town for over an hour before the boys found her a few blocks from the complex. We urged her to tell this story to the police, but they said technically no crime had been committed, so she told the head of the program. He accepted it a little too easily, as if he expected it, and we later found out that this was not the first time something like this had happened. We already knew it wasn't, because he had pictures of other girls, but an especially ugly story found its way to us. Apparently, the previous year, a South American girl was really struggling in class and received tutoring from Charles. After 2 or 3 sessions, she stopped going, despite her grades not improving. She became exceedingly closed off and stopped going out altogether, often missing class. After a few weeks, she dropped out of the program and flew back home. No one knew her well enough to ask why, but they all had a sneaking suspicion it was because of Charles. After hearing Pamela's experience, the program immediately dropped Charles as a teacher, which just proves that this was not the first complaint against him. This last bit may just be rumor, but I heard from a pretty solid source that after Pamela filed the complaint, the police checked him out, and Charles wasn't even his real name. Turns out he'd been using fake information to get teaching gigs around the country for the past 5 to 10 years, as he was actually a registered offender. When I was 20 years old, so 6 years ago, I worked as a delivery girl for a pretty popular pizzeria in my area. Initially, I worked the late morning to mid-afternoon shift, but when the guy who delivered for the night shift ended up getting fired due to losing his license because of a DUI, I was placed on the night shift since my boss hired a family friend who could only work my shift for whatever reason. I really didn't want this shift because you never know if people who order late at night actually want a pizza or if they have other intentions in mind. Unfortunately, my boss was a jerk and essentially told me if I wasn't willing to work the night shift, I was fired. I wasn't exactly in a position where I could be out of work, albeit temporarily, so I reluctantly worked the shift. The first month of this shift went by without any issues until I had to deliver a pizza to a house that just barely made our delivery radius. I punched it in on my GPS, and the house was located in a pretty suburban part of the city. I arrived, and it was about 11 p.m. The block was extremely quiet, decently lit, and mostly littered with modern townhouses, but the house I delivered to was a duplex. I rang the doorbell and waited for about 30 seconds. No answer. I rang it again and waited another 30 seconds. Still no answer. I was standing there, getting pretty nervous that something was about to go down, but thankfully, a man opened the door. He looked like he was in his late 40s. He was pretty tall, maybe a little over 6 feet, and he was very skinny. I told him his pizza was here, and he just stood there staring at me. I asked him if he was okay, and he responded by saying, "Yeah, I'm fine. Sorry. I got off work not too long ago, and I'm zoning out a bit." Fair enough, I suppose. He handed me the money, I handed him the pizza, and as I was making change, he said, "You're really beautiful, you know that?" Not really thinking too much into it, I thanked him for the compliment and gave him his change. I said goodnight, and he did too. I walked back to my car and finished my deliveries for the night. A few days later, I got a delivery order to the same place. I headed over there around the same time as last time and rang the doorbell. He answered the door very excitedly and said, "Hey, it's you again. How are you?" I told him I was tired and couldn't wait to go home, to which he chuckled and said, "I know that feeling pretty well," as he was pulling out his wallet. As he was counting his money, he asked me what my name was. Being kind of tired at this point and not really thinking straight, I stupidly told him my name. As I was making change, he asked if he could have my number, as he'd love to hang out with someone as gorgeous as I am. Whoa, buddy, pump the brakes. I'd literally only met this guy like twice to deliver a pizza. I had no idea who this guy was, and I'm positive he barely knew who I was as well. Another thing to mention is that I looked way younger than I was at the time. I was told by numerous people that I still looked like I was 15, and I was hoping he thought differently and wasn't hitting on what he thought was a teenager. I was just standing there awkwardly for a few seconds before I mustered out, "Sorry, I have a boyfriend." He got upset and said, "Oh, okay. I see." We stood there in silence before I told him to have a good night and walked back to my car. He said nothing and still stood at the doorway, staring at me until he finally went back inside once I started my car. I got a pretty creepy vibe from this guy and even brought it up to my coworkers, and they agreed it was pretty creepy. Except for my boss, who overheard everything and claimed I was making up stories and trying to gain sympathy for having to take the shift. Jerk. A week later, as I'm working the night shift, we get an order from the same guy again, and this is when things finally hit the fan. I arrived at the house at around 10:30 p.m., and keep in mind that from my perspective on the road, it didn't look like a single light in that house was on. I got out of my car and walked to the front door with the pizza box in my arms. As I was approaching the door, it quickly swung open to reveal the man, except this time he was wearing a suit, and I jumped back. He laughed and said, "Sorry if I scared you. I saw you out the window and figured I'd just open the door now so that you wouldn't have to ring the bell." I was getting scared because, as I mentioned before, there were no lights on in the house. So, was he sitting in the dark this whole time? And if so, why? I nervously laughed and said it's okay. He asked me if I liked his suit, to which I said yes. He then asked me, "Would you like to go on a date with me tonight?" What the heck? I once again told him I had a boyfriend, to which he chuckled, got close to me, and said, "Honey, there's no way a girl your age is in a serious relationship. If you go on a date with me, I'll show you how a real man treats a girl." He grabbed the pizza box from me and threw it to the side, then grabbed me by my arms hard. I'm officially freaking out at this point and trying not to cry from the fear that was overwhelming me. I started pleading with him, "Dude, please. I just want to go home. I don't want to go on a date tonight." He just stared at me with the most sinister look I've seen on someone's face and said, "I don't care. Get inside now. We're gonna have a good time." He started trying to pull me into the house, and I was trying to resist as hard as I could. After a bit of struggling, he let go of one of my arms and started grabbing something out of his pocket, which I presumed was a knife. I did something that, To this day, I am still thankful worked as he was doing that. I used my free arm to punch him as hard as I could in his stomach. This stunned him for a few seconds, and he loosened his grip on me, allowing me to break free. I quickly ran to my car, and as I got in, he ran at me and tried pulling me out of the car, holding the knife in the other arm, and even yelled, "Why are you making this so difficult?" I grabbed a half-empty soda bottle I had in the cup holder and threw it, and luckily it hit his head, causing him to let me go. I slammed the door, and then, all of a sudden, he jumped right on the hood of my car and started scratching and banging on my windshield with his knife. I put the car in reverse and quickly backed out of the spot, speeding down the road with him desperately trying to hold on. He's banging on my hood, screaming, "Stop the car." I turned onto the next road as swiftly as possible, and luckily, he fell off the hood of my car. I slammed the gas as hard as I could to get as far away from that sick individual as I could. In my panicked state, I drove a couple of blocks down the street and kept making turn after turn onto other side blocks, as I feared I was being followed. Eventually, I reached a red light, slammed on the brakes, and just sat at the intersection, frozen from what had just happened. I began crying and violently shaking as I was sitting there. It dawned on me that I came so close to losing my life, and I couldn't help but feel like I shouldn't have been alive. Once the light turned green, I pulled over to the side and just sat there crying. Eventually, I got the energy to drive back to the pizzeria, and almost immediately after I walked in, my coworker knew something was wrong after seeing me. I practically broke down in front of him, and everyone else came to the front wondering what was going on. I fought my tears and explained everything that had just happened. My coworker comforted me, and my boss surprised me by apologizing profusely for what had happened and for putting me on the night shift. He took me into the office and handed me the phone to call the authorities. They arrived at the store, and I gave them my statement, as well as took pictures of any marks on myself, as well as scratches on my car from the encounter as evidence. My coworker followed behind me as I drove home, and I collapsed on my bed. Strangely enough, I managed to fall asleep. I quit my job the next day, and luckily a friend of mine managed to hook me up with a new job at her clothing store. As far as the individual goes, 2 days later, I received an update from the police. The entire duplex was owned by the guy's brother, who lived on the right side with his wife, and the individual lived on the left side of the duplex. I learned that he had been in and out of jail constantly, at first for robberies and assaults, but later on, it was for sex crimes. He had been released from jail about 5 months before this encounter for having relations with a minor. When they arrived at the house, he was long gone, and his family had no idea where he ran off to, but the police insisted they would find him. And indeed, they did, albeit not alive. I spent the next 2 months in fear that he would find me and finish what he had in mind, but the police contacted me and updated me on the case. Apparently, he fled to another city nearby and attempted to kidnap a teenager walking alone late at night on the street. Luckily, somebody happened to be looking out the window at the right time, called the authorities, and the police caught him trying to force her into his car. He managed to flee, and the police chased after him. He blew a red light near a busy boulevard, and a van slammed right into the driver's side of his car. By some sort of miracle, the driver of the van only sustained minor injuries, while the individual succumbed to his wounds long before the ambulance even arrived. I thanked the officers for everything they did and for informing me, and I walked out of the station. I walked down the street and lit up a cigarette as I was taking in everything I had just been told. I don't wish death on people, but after hearing about his death, I felt relieved. I felt relieved that he couldn't hurt anyone anymore. I was relieved that I would never have to encounter him again and that I wouldn't have to go through with charging him and reliving what happened that night. My last experience 2 years before this was scary, but I think this one takes the cake as being the scariest, as I was alone and face to face with this individual. Who knows where I'd be if he managed to pull me into his house? This happened roughly about 2 years ago. I worked at a hotel, which had 50 rooms across 3 floors. I was the only employee in the building after about 5 p.m. It should be noted that I am a girl. The hotel is on the farther side of the city, but it's considered to be on the nicer side. So, a lot of companies will send their workers to us for room and board instead of the shadier motels on the opposite side of the city. Some of them were great guests, while others completely trashed everything, but that happens everywhere, I suppose. The layout of the building was pretty simple. You pull up to the front entrance, enter the foyer, and the front desk/lobby is right through a set of automatic doors. Right across the hall from the lobby was a staircase leading up to the second floor, and to the left were elevators to the second and third floors. The first floor only has rooms on one side to accommodate our pool, workout room, breakfast area/dining room, lobby, and office rooms, all being on the opposite side. The upper floors have rooms on each side, with the third floor having the most rooms. Typically, the third floor, the highest, was kept only for business and long stays. The second floor was reserved for short stays or larger parties, and the first floor was kept open for elders who have wheelchairs or walkers, or people who come in late at night for a one-night stay. I promise this is relevant to the story. Anyway, it was getting towards the last few hours of my shift. It was slow that night, aside from a few work groups I had checked in a few hours earlier. I noticed a raggedy, rusted, and beat-up black pickup truck pulling up into the brightly lit parking area, so I got my paperwork ready for check-in. A guy got out, completely covered in dirt. I figured he had just gotten off of work, as most guys come in covered in dirt or oil. I do specifically remember that he reeked, which isn't too out of the norm either. Entirely, I just chalked it up to him being an oil field or construction worker. I got his credentials, his name was Michael, and scanned them into the computer. He was also reluctant to leave his vehicle information with me, but I explained that if he didn't, his vehicle could be towed by morning. I thought he caved just because he was only going to be here for the night. Michael requested a second-floor room close to the lobby staircase so he could have easy access to the front doors for smoking. Not out of the norm either. After taking his payment, I set up his room keys. I explained parking, policies, and how he could get to his room, which was right up the staircase, and the door was on the opposite wall. He had a few bags with him, and he went upstairs. Almost immediately, he came back down the stairs and accused me of giving him broken room keys. I had to explain that if he put them next to his phone or anywhere near a magnet, potentially in his wallet, the keys would deactivate. I offered to take him upstairs and open the room for him to make sure the new set of keys worked, and they did. He walked into his room by himself, shut the door, so with that, I was on my way back down to the lobby. When I got back in the office, something odd caught my eye on the cameras. He hadn't left the building, but his car wasn't in the front anymore. He didn't mention anything about having another person with him. If there was, we are supposed to charge a $10 fee per extra person. The side doors don't open unless you have a room key or are on the inside of the hotel, so I started to watch the cameras to make sure he wasn't trying to sneak people in. About 20 minutes passed, and I noticed nothing happening except him coming down the stairs. I smiled politely, and he went outside. He stayed outside for about 10 minutes, just standing in the carport. I could see it on camera. Now, while I thought that was a little weird, I just chalked it up to him taking a smoke. I stopped paying attention after a while and started to file my paperwork that was due before my shift ended. Michael ran back into the hotel, cigarette still in his mouth. I instructed him that he must take his cigarette outside and put it out. I told him prior that we do not allow smoking inside the building. He just threw it on the ground and put it out with his shoe. He turned his attention toward the TV and ended up sitting in the lobby for an ungodly amount of time. He kept glancing toward the door, which made me uncomfortable. During this time, the friendly demeanor he had at check-in completely disappeared. He seemed paranoid and agitated now. He would whisper to himself. I couldn't hear what. After about 30 minutes of him doing this, I instructed him to go back up to his room because I could not have people in the lobby while I was working on closing procedures. It was a lie, but ownership allows us to make up reasons if we are uncomfortable with a guest's presence. Michael asked me to take him up to his room because he was uncomfortable and scared. I explained that I was unable to do that, for safety reasons. What I could do was watch him go up the stairs on camera, and he could call down to the office on his room phone when he arrived at his room. I was just trying to be friendly and get him upstairs as quickly as I could. He went upstairs but immediately came back down and informed me that he forgot where his room was and I would need to show him. I told him I couldn't leave the office or lobby, but I could explain to him where his room was because it was super simple. He was continuing his whispers, this time about him losing his phone. I didn't pay any mind to it. After explaining to Michael where his room was, he went back upstairs, and I heard the door slam shut. It echoed throughout the second and first floors, and it gave me chills for some reason. Almost immediately, he came back down and started yelling at me, accusing me of stealing his cell phone, claiming I was planning his demise, and insisting I needed to find his phone. This was completely bogus, as I hadn't left the office since making sure his room key worked. He asked me for help, and I just wanted him to go away. So, I slipped a screwdriver in my pocket just in case he tried to attack me, and I began rummaging through the lobby couches looking for his phone. I didn't find it, but I did find his credit card, which he also accused me of stealing. I stood my ground and said if he couldn't respect me in my place of work, I could call the police and request they escort him into his room or off the premises. He got angrier, snatched his card from my hands, and went back outside. After about 20 more minutes, he came back inside. He was calmer, but he asked if I would please go outside with him because something was wrong with his car. After I absolutely refused, he told me I needed to go outside. He said it wasn't fair that he was the only person outside working on his car, and he just needed some help. I had to explain that I'm not allowed to accompany a guest outside the building. He just started repeating that I absolutely had to go outside with him. Now, I have anxiety, and I tend to let my mind roam over wide horizons, and this was no different. I was about to have a panic attack, so I called the owners and asked them what I should do. It was my first hotel job, and although I had tons of freedom doing my job, I still wanted to know how to properly handle these situations. The owner told me if I was uncomfortable and suspected he was under the influence or a danger to myself or others, I had full authority to call the police and have them ban him from the property. I asked if they could just keep an eye on the cameras they had access to at home because he was acting strangely. I locked all the lobby doors and made sure the side and fire exits were properly secured and closed so no one could sneak in. I did this while on the phone with my boss because I was scared to leave the office by myself. After getting back behind the office, I locked the door and braced myself for him to come back inside. My boss told me to just watch the cameras and keep my cell phone nearby in case I needed to call for help. Meanwhile, I noticed on the cameras that I couldn't see Michael anymore. I didn't know where he had parked, but I definitely wasn't going to go looking. What I did notice was another vehicle driving through our parking lot. I called the hotel next door to ask if the car was on their cameras, too, and was informed it was an unknown vehicle to their records. It was unknown to mine as well. This sent my anxiety through the roof. The car kept driving around the back of the building, to the front, but avoided the carport, then turned into the same at the building next door. The parking lot was almost empty, so I knew they weren't looking for a parking spot. The car kept going, and I was so focused on watching it on the camera that I didn't notice Michael came back inside. Telling him he either needed to go up to his room or vacate the premises, he just continued to yell at me, insisting I needed to go outside with him. He wouldn't move from in front of the entrance, and I imagined he was staying within view of whoever else he kept looking back at. Then, out of nowhere, I saw him sprint across the parking lot and out of the camera view. I also didn't see the car anymore after that. Since it was practically the end of my shift, I somehow managed to get everything done just in time for the next shift to arrive. I was so glad to see her I almost cried. I explained to her what happened and that the owners wanted her to keep the lobby doors locked. We put up signs explaining that our doors were broken, and for safety reasons, guests would have to call for entry or use the side entrances to their rooms. I also deactivated Michael's room keys and told the next shift not to let him back in. If he showed up, she was to call the police because he was a security risk. I made sure she watched me get into my Uber ride after triple checking the vehicle and driver matched what my phone said. Since I was a regular customer of the driver, he asked why I was so rattled. I asked him to drive through the parking lot with his doors closed so I could see if Michael's truck or the other vehicle I saw driving across the parking lot were anywhere near the buildings, and they weren't. I have no idea what happened to them. The next day, I had my boyfriend come stay with me during the entire evening shift, just in case he came back. I was told by my bosses that Michael never came to get his things and wouldn't pick up the phone either. Nothing happened that night or any other night, except for a month later. Michael came in asking about his stuff and if he could get a room. I refused his room, and luckily, there were other people with me in the lobby and in the office. I had our maintenance man retrieve his items and explained he was no longer allowed on the property. If we saw him, we would call the police and he would be arrested for trespassing. Again, this wasn't true, but we didn't want him coming back at all. I noticed Michael had a different vehicle this time. It was a newer model SUV, maroon in color. It matched neither his beat-up black pickup truck nor the dark-colored sedan I saw driving in circles. If there was anything that sat with me, even after all this time, it was that he remembered my name. He addressed me by my name when he walked up to the counter, and at first, I thought, oh, yeah, my name is part of my uniform, until I realized I forgot to put on my name tag that day. After that, I refused to wear one in the hotel. Management let me create a fake name and wear that from then on. It took me a while to feel safe in the building again while I was alone. I constantly had my boyfriend with me while I worked the evening shift. There's a chance the guy and the circling vehicle are unrelated, but my anxiety and the aura I got from Michael that night, it didn't feel good or right. I bought a house and had a surprise guest. My partner and I recently bought our first home. On the day of closing, the selling realtor told us that the seller hadn't given her the keys to the house and claimed to have never had a garage door opener. When asked when we could obtain the keys, the selling realtor explained that the seller worked an hour away in long hours, so we couldn't get the keys until 9 or 10 at night. Instead, the selling realtor arranged and paid for new locks on the front door and gave us money to buy garage door openers. Yay, free locks. So, we closed on the house, and everything else went smoothly until I went to set up and turn on our electricity. The electric company told me they couldn't come turn our power until the next day, even though I had called earlier in the morning. Mega I roll. The house needed a good cleaning, as the seller hadn't bothered to clean when they moved out. Let me first describe the house layout. When you walk through the front door, it opens to the living area with the kitchen to the left, a nice open concept. Part of the kitchen is hidden from the front door due to stairs leading to the basement, so you can't see the oven or the fridge. The neighborhood is one of the safest in my area. I had to use the front door to move things in since the locks were installed before I arrived, so I didn't bother locking the door. Okay, moving on with the story. Since I didn't have electricity, I decided to start by cleaning the fridge. I turned on a true crime/true horror podcast and got to work. The doors to the fridge were wide open, and I was doing my thing when a shadow appeared behind me. I knew this wasn't my partner because he was teaching. I turned around to see a man in a black hoodie and black shorts telling me he was here to drop off a garage door opener. He dropped the opener on the island and didn't say another word. I probably spooked him just as much as he spooked me because he didn't say another word and ran out the door. It took me a while to compose myself again, and I called my partner, hoping he was on break, to tell him what had happened. I also texted our realtor about this. It was a very weird interaction. I wondered if I had just missed a knock because I was in the zone, but he didn't knock. I know this because less than an hour later, another man knocked on the door and explained he was here to drop off a key to the front door. And if he tried the doorbell, I didn't hear it because there wasn't any electricity. We are still doing work on the house before we officially move in. I am now ultra spooked being in the house alone and refuse to listen to a true crime podcast while the house is empty. I was raised in a fairly strict but loving Christian household in a Bible Belt section of the States. My parents weren't at all unreasonable in their rules and were well-intentioned, but like most teenagers, I broke a few along the way. The summer before I started college, I began a relationship with a slightly older guy. I knew him from high school, and he was attending the college I would soon be at. Johnny was a catch. He was exceptionally handsome, had been on the football team, and was on a full academic scholarship. Funny, talented, and very personable, there was little to not like about him. We bonded over our teetotalism and love of pranking. The best part, he had his own apartment at the college, which was a 4-hour drive from my parents' house. I could easily sneak up there under the guise of visiting one of my other friends or spending the night at a local girlfriend's house. My parents didn't even have to know I had a boyfriend. Now, I had just turned 18 and was enjoying my rebellious streak and newfound freedom. But I still happily lived under my parents' guidance and rules for the most part. They always encouraged me to be a free thinker and to ultimately figure out my own morals and values, and I ended up much like them, because they're honestly that awesome. My mom, wisely, encouraged me not to just sleep with anyone, and it was something I actually held to quite strongly. So I had no qualms about having sleepovers with my boyfriend. I was intent on not having sex with him. He took it pretty well and seemed to respect my decision. One week, smack dab in the middle of summer, I had 3 days off in a row at work. A drive up to see Johnny was in order, and I began my travel early in the morning. He was excited to see me, and we had a great day, Nerf gun wars, reading Stephen King, making out. We went out for dinner and returned for a night of shenanigans, or so I thought. Upon entering his apartment, Johnny produced a box of condoms. He had tried this before, so I wasn't fazed and adamantly told him it wasn't happening. The events that unfolded following this seemingly unimportant interaction still haunt me today. Johnny's smile disappeared, and his eyes went cold. Hauntingly cold. I was sitting at his dining room table with my back against the wall, and he was standing at the other end of the small table. You make me sick. I'm sick of you. You play me. All you do is play me. We were serial pranksters and sarcastic in every sense of the word. While his countenance made my skin crawl, I knew he was joking. I had known Johnny for years, after all. I've thought about this for a long time, and you're dead. I'm not doing this anymore. You make me so sick. I hate you, and you're dead. He was unnervingly calm, and his voice betrayed a slight hint of anger I'd never heard before. I noticed him clenching his fists, popped out veins tracing up his arms. For the first time in our entire relationship, I felt unsafe with him. He held my gaze, unblinking. His second-floor apartment was on campus. It was summer. I had seen nobody else in the building, no other cars in the parking lot. Even if I could get past him, which I couldn't, my two options were unlocking the balcony door and jumping, or racing 15 feet down the hallway to the deadbolt front door, which opened inwardly, and getting down a flight of stairs. Either scenario led to an empty parking lot. I would have to get to my car or run into the woods nearby. While athletic, I had no chance against him physically. I focused on him. Half of me just knew he was kidding. He had to be. He would break into laughter any second now, and we would return to our beautiful day. He continued talking. I can't repeat what he said. It was too graphic and specific to our location to write out in a public forum. He detailed the assault he had in store for me. If I survived, I would be strangled in the nearby woods, then carted off and dumped at a secluded spot we had explored together. He motioned to some bags he had on his counter. That's where your body will be within an hour. I had enough. His plan was too well thought out to be impromptu. I'm small, but I'm stubborn, and I would fight to the death if I had to. I also have a wicked straight face when I need to. It was my turn to hold his gaze with all the ferocity I could muster. I stood up and said the first thing that came to mind. I'm still proud of the unflinching calm I presented. Inside, I was begging God not to let me die. You're real funny. I almost believed you for a second. Wouldn't have worked anyway, though, because what I was going to tell you before all that happened is my dad asked me to come home tonight. He needs help first thing in the morning with the garden for Mom's birthday because Kyle, my brother, hurt his back, and I told him I'd call him as soon as I was on the road within half an hour. It was a lie, and not a particularly good one, but the delivery was convincing. I dangled my phone in his face and told him he could explain to my dad why I wasn't coming home tonight if he wanted me to stay. Johnny's mouth was agape as he stared at me. I was just kidding, he mumbled, fists still clenched. See ya. I chirped, pushing past him. My gamble paid off. I grabbed my purse and shuffled down the hallway. I could feel his eyes burning through me and the electric energy in the room as I internally screamed at myself to move slowly. The deadbolt disengaged. I walked out and fought every urge to run down the stairs. I was too far from my car if he chased me to beat him, and I refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing me scared. I walked the entire length of the car park. I've always had a habit of parking as far out as possible, next to the woods he told me he would murder me in. I knew he was watching me the entire time. I could feel his eyes follow my every movement. As I drove out past his apartment, I saw his shadow in the balcony window. I waved, and he stared. I drove a few miles to the nearest Walmart. It was only 8, and the sun was just starting to set. People milled through the parking lot, blissfully unaware of what I'd just gone through. I collapsed onto my steering wheel and broke down, bawling my eyes out. Then I drove the 4 hours back home. Stupidly, I didn't know how to process what happened and banished it to the recesses of my mind. I spent the next few years avoiding Johnny. The few times I thought about it, I blamed myself for being so naive. I finally told my mom 4 years after the fact and was able to process it. So, possible murderer ex-boyfriend, who thankfully now lives about 10,000 miles away from me, let's not meet again. I live in a middle-class neighborhood in the Caribbean. It's a quiet place where nothing happens, the type of place people go to retire and sip pina coladas all day. However, a few houses down from mine lived a family that was different from the rest. They had the biggest house on the street and lived luxuriously. Their kids would play with me, especially the youngest girl we all nicknamed Tiny. Tiny was about 5 when I was 11, and she was always at my house. I knew my mom and the neighbors were concerned about a 5-year-old being outside all day and not arriving at her house until midnight on school nights, but it was a quiet place where nothing happened, so no one got too worried. When Tiny turned 6, her parents threw a giant birthday party for her, and all the neighborhood kids were invited. I wanted to go. They had bouncy houses, water slides, and everything a kid could want to play with, but my parents didn't allow me to go. I never knew why. I suppose it was because my mom didn't know her mom. I remember feeling very sad because everyone else was there, and I was playing alone at my house. After the birthday, things went back to normal. One day, we were all playing and talking about what our parents did for work. We asked Tiny and her siblings, but none of them knew what their parents did except that their dad traveled a lot and was always at meetings. I didn't pay much attention, and we all continued with our day. One night, we were playing on the street when we started hearing loud pops coming from Tiny's house. I will never forget that day. The neighbors, including my mom, rushed outside, yelling for us to get inside, saying it was gunshots. Some of us got into my house, and we stayed there as my next-door neighbor, a cop, ran toward Tiny's house. All we saw after the gunshots were a black van rushing down the street, almost hitting a dog. Some men entered the house. Tiny and her siblings wanted to see what was going on, but everyone forbade them from going. All I remember is a bunch of cops and ambulances a few minutes later, and the next day, I never saw Tiny or her siblings again. For a couple of months, the house sat empty, but black vans and strange men kept coming into the neighborhood, going door to door asking for any information about the man and his children. No one in the neighborhood spoke about it. I know the cops asked me about Tiny and her siblings, and if they ever said anything strange about their parents, but I was only 11 and more concerned about playing Mario Kart than about what happened that night. Years passed, and the story faded away. Now that I'm grown up, I asked my neighbor, the cop, what went down that night. There were rumors that the man had died. He said that night, the man had a gun emptied into his skull, and his wife was gravely wounded. She survived, because he was a substance lord who was going to make a deal with the police to turn in his rival gangs and some other people. The men in the van, who had been going door to door, wanted to know where his kids and wife were to also shut them up. As for the kids, his oldest son was found dead a few hours away in a neighboring town, his car set ablaze. His other children are now living in other countries under witness protection programs. I just hope, wherever Tiny is, she's doing okay and that her family got the help they needed. Edit. I found the only news link and asked my neighbor to give me more details. The wife was shot in the leg, causing massive blood loss, but she was overall fine. This was the first major news in my town, besides the Kamui massacre in the 70s when a prominent woman was hacked to death alongside her adult daughter by the daughter's husband. The news is in Spanish. Also, I got an update on Tiny. She's fine. I don't know which country she's in, but from the time she's called the neighbors in the past few years, she's been doing well and has a kid. Somebody tried to get into my car in an empty car park. Last year, I was staying in a university hall for my final year. It's a private building, not connected to the university, and is located in the city near the main town. We have a car park, but nobody really uses it because we are poor students, and it costs money to park there, so mine was one of only 2 or 3 cars at any given time. The car park isn't well lit and is to the side of the building, so you have to walk for about 2 or 3 minutes to get to the main door. I was sitting in my car one evening after getting back from the gym, just scrolling on my phone because my seat was warm and it was dark and raining outside, so I couldn't be bothered to get up yet. I was reading an article when suddenly someone started knocking on my window, which was really odd. It was a man dressed all in black, and he started telling me how his friend had seen me through the window and thought I was really attractive, so could he have my number? I responded, "No, that's a bit odd, and I don't feel comfortable with it." He continued to be insistent for a while, practically begging me to get out and give them my number or my social media details, telling me I should come over and speak to his friend, who was, weirdly, standing at the other side of the car park, furthest from the building. I kept saying no and scrolling on my phone to show that I wasn't interested. He finally relented and walked away. I texted one of my friends to ask if he could come and get me and walk with me to the building. As I was waiting, this man returned, but now with his head up, and he started banging loudly on my window, saying that I was being rude, ungrateful, calling me all kinds of names. I kept staring at my phone and pretended I couldn't hear him. He then started trying my door handle. Thankfully, I'd locked my car after the first encounter, and then began violently pushing into my car when it didn't work. I still kept ignoring him and texted for my friend to probably bring some other friends with him. My friend was taking a long time to read my message, and I was terrified, but for some reason didn't think to call the police, probably because I was scared of things escalating. The guy at my window had calmed down after a few minutes and walked off, saying that he'd leave me alone now. However, I watched him out of the corner of my eye join up with his friend and then maybe 3 or 4 other men. They walked so that they were out of sight, but I could see their shadows lingering as they kind of circled around my car and moved towards the building, staying in the dark. They lingered there for a while until, luckily, another car came, which was obviously full of students going to a party due to the loud music and singing going on inside. This group of men left as they saw these people arrive, and I latched onto them and was able to walk with them as they entered the building. When I got home, my friend finally responded. He said that he actually heard about these guys before. Apparently, they'd followed another girl into the building and into the lift a couple of days prior, then stood in the lift making really inappropriate comments to her. She'd had to run to her door and lock it, where they then stood outside knocking on the door and whispering for her to open it. We were able to report this to the building, who, to their credit, then hired a permanent set of security staff. We also got the CCTV footage of both incidents and were able to pass this on to the police. A little over a year ago, I had a job working overnight at a gas station close to my house. I'm a woman and was 31 at the time. I know, to some, it seems unsafe for a woman to work the graveyard shift by herself. However, it was a slow store, and the sheriff's office was about 20 feet across from it. I really didn't think I would have that many problems. There would be about 30 customers in an 8-hour shift, and that was on a busier night. It was about 3:30 in the morning. I went outside to sweep the parking lot and do a last-minute check of the trash. It was time for a cigarette, and I had one headphone in, kind of jamming out. Across the road in the parking lot of the sheriff's office, I saw a figure with his back to me. He was swaying back and forth while looking down. Honestly, it looked like he was enjoying a much-needed piss. Against the sheriff's office, though? Yeah, the building closed at 4 p.m. and didn't open again until 6 the next morning. But why? By the back of his ripped white t-shirt, I remembered that he had come in about 4 hours earlier. He was a total creep, and I could already tell he had a good buzz going. I didn't say anything. I just took my eyes off of him and tried not to draw attention to myself. It was working until a car pulled in. I was still outside as they pulled up. I saw him look at the car, then at me, and back and forth again. As the customer was leaving, I walked her outside. I still had half a smoke burning and had left my dustpan outside with the squeegee. We both heard him start to swear angrily and seemingly engage in an argument with himself. She looked across the road and told me to be careful. I made an awkward joke about him being the one who should be more afraid of me or something like that. The man was still there, but closer to the road, now facing the parking lot of my store. Whatever he was yelling was completely unintelligible. He was obviously very drunk and could barely stand straight, still swaying away. I didn't engage him, but I didn't take my eyes off of him this time. I just slowly walked back into the store. Something about his face really bothered me. It had a darkness to it, but his eyes looked wild. My experience during graveyard jobs has been that the crazy-eyed ones are the worst ones. I didn't like it at all and wanted no part of it. I still had almost 3 hours to go and 2 before any other employees got there. Instantly, I went to the computer and typed up a temporarily closed sign just in case he wanted trouble. I was coming around the counter on my way to the doors when I saw that he'd walked across the road to my side now. I literally just barely got the second door locked when he stumbled into our very small parking lot. My hand signal for cut across my neck, basically saying, "Nope, sorry, you can't come in here. We're closed." I shook my head back and forth too, hoping to further discourage him. He started walking away but screamed something at me while he was walking. I don't mean he was grumpy and shouted at me or yelled that I was an expletive or anything. I mean, like, he was at an enraged volume and was violently throwing his hands everywhere. Definitely knowing I'm in the wrong shift of the wrong job, I got really skeeved out. I decided to call the cops. It's a good thing too, because the minute I hung up with him, there he comes again up to the door. He starts pulling and banging on it. He backs up and runs into it, trying to ram it, not that it would have done any good. I made the mistake of telling him that I had called the cops, and his substance-filled ass was about to be grass. I say I made the mistake of telling him because once I said that, he took off. The police never found him. They drove around the road and surrounding neighborhoods for over an hour, but found no one. He was on foot, so I don't get where he could have gone to. He didn't harm me, and with them not finding him, I didn't fill out a police report or anything. I was safe behind thick glass doors that were locked for the rest of my shift. It just sucked. Maybe if I didn't warn him ahead of time, I wouldn't have had to spend the last 3 months of my job constantly looking over my shoulder. I'll never know what the right choice was. I'm just glad I don't work there anymore. This took place a while ago, 2015, but I'll probably never forget it. I, around 21 at the time, female, was still fairly new to my city. I had just gotten out of a bad relationship, wasn't in the best place mentally, and didn't know many people in town besides my ex and his friends. I was on a dating/hookup app looking for people to hang out with casually, maybe find a friend with benefits or something. I matched with a 25-year-old guy, Simon. We talked sporadically on the app for a few days. He explained that he was in a band and living in a house with his bandmates. He sent me their music, which was just audio on YouTube with a heavily edited still image of 4 or 5 guys playing rock instruments, one of whom looked like him. The music was an interesting combination of styles and not really for me, but whatever. He seemed like a nice enough guy. He stopped replying for a few days, and I figured that was that, so I moved on. Then, one day, I was at work and got a message from him apologizing for being so busy and inviting me to a barbecue with his friends and bandmates in their yard. He had mentioned that their band manager was providing them with a house to live in. Based on the lack of views on the YouTube video and the fact that I only saw one photo of him playing in the band, I figured he was probably exaggerating the band manager thing. I thought it was more likely something along the lines of a bar manager friend giving them a discount on rent in exchange for being a house band at their bar. I didn't think much of it beyond that. Normally, I would have just said no to going to a barbecue alone at the home of someone I didn't really know. But I was bored, figured I might be able to overcome some social anxiety, and maybe even make some female friends there since he made it sound like a pretty big party. I put the neighborhood he gave me into maps, and it was a suburban area with lots of families as far as I knew. I figured being in a yard on such a nice summer day wouldn't be overly risky because lots of neighbors would be outside. Plus, it was just a few train stops away from my workplace, and I was off in a few hours. I told him I wasn't overly comfortable with the idea since I didn't know him well, but I would stop by for a bit if I didn't need to go inside the house at all. He said that was totally fine, which made me feel a lot better. I even made sure not to drink anything for the rest of my shift so I wouldn't risk needing to go inside to use the bathroom. I was anxious about showing up to a barbecue with people I didn't know, as he implied that the event was already underway. Plus, I would have had a hard time finding a specific address from the backyard side, so I asked Simon if he could meet me at the train station since he said it was a quick walk anyway. He agreed, and I let him know I was leaving work and what time maps said the train would get to his station. I sent Simon a message to tell him that I had arrived at the train station around 5:30 after looking around and not finding him. He told me he was running behind and to just start walking toward the neighborhood. I was about halfway across the massive train station parking lot when I saw him slowly wandering toward me. I recognized his clothes. He was wearing bell-bottoms, which weren't common, especially for men, and long hair from far away. Up close, though, his face looked pretty different from his photos. It might have been heavy-duty editing, I don't even know. He kind of looked like a different guy, older than the 25-year-old in the photos by 5 to 10 years. Maybe he used photos of his brother or something. I don't even know, it was before AI. This was the first real red flag, but I brushed it off. Maybe he's just self-conscious. Maybe he smokes a lot, doesn't wear sunscreen, and hasn't taken pictures in a while. All of his pictures looked candid, so I figured he wasn't much of a selfie guy. Besides, I was mostly there to make friends anyway, so I shouldn't judge his appearance so harshly. He was also clearly already drunk, but a lot of my ex's friends were heavy drinkers, so that didn't seem strange. He was hosting a barbecue, after all. The second red flag came shortly after when we arrived at the front door. I reminded him that I wasn't comfortable going inside the house, but he assured me we would just have to walk through to get to the backyard. Okay, fine. It wasn't the kind of neighborhood where you could just walk around the house to get to the backyard. We would have had to backtrack to the main road to go down the alley directly to the backyard. I figured he just forgot what I said about not wanting to go inside and didn't want to cause a bunch of trouble, so I went with it. We got into the house, and he immediately closed the door and locked the deadbolt and knob behind me. I didn't think that was too weird since nobody was hanging out inside, and a lot of people are just in the habit of locking the door when they come in. But it still gave me the heebie-jeebies for some reason. Then Simon told me he'd really like to give me a tour of the house. I politely declined and reminded him that I was just there for the barbecue. He said that he and his bandmates had worked really hard to get the house and he was really proud of it. At that point, I was getting really skeptical because usually, when guys told me things that seemed a bit far-fetched, they'd let the truth slip by the time they got me to their house. But still, I convinced myself that I was being unreasonable. I was already in the stupid house anyway. He insisted it'd be quick, not the wisest choice, I know. But I was pretty good at explaining away red flags, so at this point, Simon still mostly had a dopey, stoner art guy kind of vibe as far as I was concerned. He really didn't seem like a threat, just an insecure oddball who sucked at communicating and fibbed a bit. Not unlike my ex, who was definitely emotionally and verbally abusive, but it never escalated past that. I figured, at worst, he'd get handsy, and I'd get called a prude for not sleeping with him. I didn't have much self-worth at the time, obviously, so I went with it. The tour started pretty uneventfully, other than that the decor in the common areas was obviously chosen by a middle-aged Martha Stewart enthusiast, not a bunch of guys in a band or their fake band manager. I didn't know if this should make me feel better or worse. On one hand, he was clearly lying, but on the other, it made me think it was probably just someone's mom's house. She was out of town, and he didn't want to admit he lived at a friend's parents' home and didn't actually have a paying job. Again, a total red flag, but I rationalized it at the time. The bedroom doors were all closed, and the bathroom was unremarkable. He then showed me the kitchen, and I finally saw through the window that there was nobody in the backyard. There weren't even barbecue supplies around, no burgers thawing on the counter, no cocktail supplies lying about, nothing. I asked him where everyone was and why he lied about the barbecue. He told me that his bandmates were on tour still, just running behind due to van trouble, but they should be back any minute so we could start the party. I asked why he wasn't on tour with them if he was in the band. I don't even remember his answer to that because it didn't make any sense. At this point, I was out of mental gymnastics to convince myself that this guy wasn't just completely full of it, and I was really freaked out. Took me long enough. I'm smarter now, don't worry. I started trying to figure out a way to get out of this situation. I hoped that once he was done with the tour, we could go outside, even just for a minute, and I'd leave. I'd been in some sketchy situations in the past, but luckily, nothing so bad that they tried very hard to physically stop me when I walked away in a semi-public place. I just wasn't comfortable doing it inside the house. I knew this guy was full of it, but I had no idea how much worse it would get. I instinctively pretended to believe his nonsense. He offered me a beer. I said no thanks because I had to work in the morning. He said okay and cracked one for himself. Then he wanted to take the tour downstairs. From the top of the stairs, I could see the basement was dark and creepy with really small windows, so I refused. I asked if we could go back outside. He said, after the tour. I tried to argue about going into the basement and told him I had a spider phobia and didn't like basements, etc. All lies, but anything to keep him from realizing he was what I was afraid of. He started to get agitated about my reluctance, so I figured it would be better to let him show me the damn basement and then, hopefully, we could go outside because I didn't know what else to do. The basement was fairly unremarkable, couch, TV, elliptical, until I noticed something that gave me chills. The house was probably built in the 1990s or late 80s at the absolute earliest, but I saw a door that looked just like the heavy, foam-lined door to the cold storage room in my grandma's house. The kind that only opened from the outside. It was a smaller version of the big metal doors on commercial walk-in fridges. It looked really out of place in this house. I absolutely would not go anywhere near that door. He opened it and told me it was their soundproof music studio. I looked inside from a few meters away. It did indeed look soundproof. It was about the size of a bedroom, and I could see a few guitars and amps in it. Mattress toppers were on the walls. No drum kit or recording equipment that I could see. He insisted I go inside to get a better look. He was standing outside the door, motioning for me to go in. Holy shit, the alarm bells were really going off now. At this point, I realized I could totally die here if I wasn't careful, and I turned around to run up the stairs. He closed the door and followed me, asking what was wrong, acting like I was being unreasonable for not wanting to see his soundproof music studio. That's when I realized this was a way sketchier situation than anything my ex had ever pulled, and I was completely freaked out. At that point, my main objective was getting out of the house. The front and back doors were both closed and locked, so if I tried to run, he'd be able to get to me before I could get the locks open. The bathroom did not have a window. The house had a convoluted floor plan that I wasn't familiar with, and he was much bigger than I am. He was the tall, lanky type who can run fast even if they're out of shape and smoke a pack a day. I pretended that I was okay with hanging out with him in the hopes that he'd chill out a bit. We made small talk for a few minutes. He cracked another beer, and thankfully, he calmed down. I desperately mentioned yet again that it was beautiful outside and suggested we go sit in the yard while we wait. He said no and started to get agitated that I wanted to leave already. I told him I could stay, but that I'd just really like to smoke a cigarette. He told me we could smoke cigarettes inside and pointed to a cereal bowl full of cigarette butts. God damn it. We sat down at the table and lit some cigarettes. As he was smoking, he started rolling a joint, which he promptly lit as soon as his cigarette was done. He offered me some, and I said, "No thanks." He insisted, so I took the smallest puff I could. I'm a pretty seasoned weed smoker, but I pretended to cough excessively and told him I was a novice, so that was more than enough for me. For a liar himself, he thankfully wasn't very good at picking up on the lies of others. After we smoked, he asked if I'd like to watch a movie until his bandmates got back. I told him I was really looking forward to spending the day outside and suggested we go for a walk or visit the park, ideas he did not like or appreciate. At this point, I was trying to keep as much distance as possible between us, but he stayed close enough to me that I could smell the beer on his breath. He grabbed me by the waist, and I backed away and asked about the barbecue food to try and change the subject, making him think I still believed what he was telling me. He started to get angry again and sternly reiterated that his bandmates should be home any minute. My anxiety was absolutely through the roof. I tried to calm him down again with generic small talk. Now, I don't know how I got so lucky, but the next thing that happened might have saved me. Simon went to the fridge to get another beer and pulled out an empty box. At this point, he was getting even more pissed off than before, so I went out on a limb and suggested we go get some more beer for the party, because I was out of ideas. I was terrified it would enrage him even more to suggest, once again, that we leave the house, but I had to try. Thankfully, his eyes lit up with the possibility that I could actually be down to drink with him, and he agreed. As we were walking to the liquor store, I still didn't really have a plan because I was no longer comfortable just walking away from this menace in this weirdly desolate suburb. But I was extremely relieved to be out of that house. I walked with him to the liquor store, and when we got there, I told him I didn't need to go inside if he was just going to grab some beer. He insisted that I had to go inside. At that point, I was so stressed and frazzled I just went with him and hoped that a good opportunity to leave would arise. When we got inside the liquor store, he asked what kind of beer I wanted. I reminded him that I had to work tomorrow and didn't want to drink much. He demanded to know what kind of beer I wanted, so I just named the first one that came to mind. We went to pay. The cashier was kind of an asshole, so I didn't ask for help. I probably should have, but I panicked and didn't. I hoped there might be somebody in the parking lot who could help me if I made a scene, but there was nobody. I regretted not asking the liquor store guy for help, but I also remembered the times my ex told people I was crazy so they wouldn't take me seriously. The liquor store guy definitely seemed like he would have fallen for that, so it was probably for the best I didn't expect him to help me. I had one last idea before I took my chances just trying to run and or scream. There was a substance store across from the liquor store. I told Simon I had to go buy a toothbrush or something that vaguely implied I might stay over. He eagerly agreed but tried to follow me into the store. I told him you're not allowed to bring beer into a substance store. I don't know if that's even true. I really doubt it's any kind of law, but luckily this drunk douchebag believed it and agreed to wait outside. Now, my naive ass thought maybe I could just wander around this store for long enough and he would either get the hint or get bored and leave. But no, I must have wandered around the store for at least half an hour, and this jackass was still just standing there staring in the window. This creep didn't even have his phone out. Every time I checked if he was still there, he was just staring through the window looking for me. I ended up hovering around the tills and waited until a big group of friendly-looking people were paying. I followed them out of the store and immediately told Simon to leave me alone and go home. I said it firmly and loudly enough to imply that I would make a scene if need be. Simon looked at the people getting in their car, who were now pausing and looking at us because I had nearly yelled at him. Then he just turned around and left. It was bizarrely anticlimactic, which I was very thankful for. I ran to the train station, which, thankfully, was in a different direction than his house from the store, and I never heard from him again. When I got home, his app profile had either blocked me or been deleted. Years later, after I stopped compartmentalizing the whole thing, I wished I would have reported him or something. It bothers me to wonder if he tried it again with someone else but made sure the fridge was stocked first. At the time, though, I didn't think anybody would take me seriously. I was embarrassed about my choices and just wanted to move on from the whole thing. Plus, all I really had was a likely fake first name and a general idea of where the house was, which probably wasn't even his. I'll probably never know any more than I do now, and maybe that's for the best. This happened a few years ago. I live alone with my 2 cats. We live in a flat, but the front door is at street level. When you open the door, you go up the stairs, and you're already inside the flat. I don't have a garden either. Now, I'm in my mid-30s, female, very small and petite, and lucky enough to still look young. I still get ID for cigarettes and alcohol. I also smoke outside by the front door because I don't like smoking inside, yep, even when it's raining. I don't live in a rough part of town, so it's fairly usual to say hello to people walking by. They're used to seeing me smoking outside, so we often exchange greetings. People regularly use this area as a shortcut. My last cigarette is around 11:30 p.m. before I go to bed. Of course, when it's really dark, it can feel unnerving, but as I said, it's a nice area. With all that said, my flat is only one of 2 in this area. It's not the best looking. The rest are houses, beautiful houses, pretty decorations, nice cars, pretty flowers, etc. Basically, richer and a lot nicer than mine. I'm pretty poor, and you can tell. For a few weeks before this incident, I kept hearing my front door handle moving as though someone had tried to open it. I put it down to kids walking to school. Then it had happened in the middle of the day. Then the evening. But each time I got to the bottom of the stairs, no one was around. One night, I went for my last cigarette around 11:30 p.m., got ready, and went to bed. I fell asleep quickly. At one point, I woke up slightly because I heard the cats playing. I rolled over and went back to sleep. They woke me up again. I could still hear them playing, but I also heard them growling while they were lying next to me in bed. I sat bolt upright and realized the sounds were coming from the front door. The cats were still growling. I snuck into the hall and peered down the stairs. I could see the front door handle turning. For the first time in my life, my brain thought faster than my mouth, and I switched the stairs light on. There was a pause, with my door open a few inches, then I heard feet running away. I ran down the stairs, slammed the door shut again, and then ran back up to call the police. This was around 1 a.m. They finally came out at 5 a.m. I didn't sleep. I sat in a chair watching the stairs all night, absolutely terrified whoever it was would come back. I didn't even go for a cigarette, even though I desperately wanted one, because I was too afraid that they'd be waiting. The police showed me how they'd gotten in. They damaged the door frame and the seal along the door. I don't know what it's called, that bit of material or plastic. It was all cut and ripped up. I called my landlord first thing in the morning and had deadbolts fitted. I'm now overly cautious when I smoke. I don't stay in one place anymore. I go for a little walk each time, and I don't stick to the same timings either. I definitely listen to the cats better. If they're growling, there's a reason for it. I'm so glad they growled that night. If they hadn't, I would have ignored it and gone back to sleep again. Then I would have woken up with someone in my home, doing who knows what for who knows why. My horse tried to warn me. This happened a few nights ago. I'm a 25-year-old female, 115 pounds, and I was out with my thoroughbred, Shane, doing fitness work on the cross-country course. If you don't know what that is, Imagine a huge area full of fields, ditches, woods, etc., with jumps placed strategically throughout, designed to test horse and rider stamina. We were getting ready to head in after an evening of hard work. It wasn't dark yet, but was slowly getting there, prompting me to wrap up for the day. As we were walking around the area where we had been working, my horse started refusing to go near a patch of woods. We had gone by it several times that evening, so I urged him forward to investigate. That's when I heard what I thought was a human voice. I quickly realized someone had been watching us the entire time. This property is on 700 acres, and this section was nowhere near a road. That meant this person had very intentionally made their way close to where a rider might be. I didn't want to startle Shane, so I calmly turned him around and began a fast walk around that patch of woods, giving it a very wide berth. My plan was to head straight back to the main barn. However, as we got to the middle of the field, Shane halted. By then, it was almost dark, but I noticed something unsettling. There were people in the woods across the field in front of me, exactly where my safest exit was located. At that point, I had somebody in the woods about 50 yards behind me, and what sounded like multiple people in the woods 50 yards in front of me. I briefly considered taking another exit route, but as I mentioned before, this was very far from the road. My immediate thought was that they hadn't walked there, they likely had a vehicle of some sort. Even if Shane and I could have beaten them to the gate, they could have caught up while I was opening it. We stood there for maybe 30 seconds, and simultaneously, Shane and I came to the same conclusion: if we went now, we could beat them. We bolted across the field, slowed slightly to cross a ditch in the woods, the one they seemed to be trying to block me at, and flew to the gate just beyond it. I jumped off, unlatched the gate, and didn't even stop to mount the horse again. He's very tall, and I'm average height. English saddles are different from Western ones, and I'm not one of those cool people who can just swing up. Instead, I grabbed his reins, and together we bolted to the barn. Within 20 yards, we were within shouting distance. I started hollering, "There are people out there at the entrance. Guys, come here." As soon as I began making a fuss, a four-wheeler started up from just behind the gate and sped away. A police report was made, and the next day, evidence of 2 four-wheelers was found. That matches what I saw, as there were people basically surrounding me. We're not going to stop riding out there, but the barn owners are taking precautions. For now, we won't be out there alone or at night. They may have just been teenagers looking to scare a rider, but either way, it wasn't cool. And the fact that they tried to sneakily block my exit route? I can't imagine their intentions were pure. Thank God for my hypersensitive horse. Without him forcing me to pay attention, I might never have noticed the people, especially the ones in front of me, moving in the woods while trying to be quiet. Shane was a very good boy that day. This happened in my hometown when I was 7, 36 now. For context, I lived on an island off the coast of Washington State in a military town that is among the safest places to live in all of the U.S. But weirdos are everywhere. The timing is vague for me, but since I was outside playing with my friends, it was likely a summer evening just before dinner. We were screwing around, riding our bikes in the street, running around, the usual kid stuff, when a car pulled up and stopped in the middle of the street. I don't remember exactly what the man driving it said, but he must have beckoned me over because I know I walked close enough to hear. He asked me if I had seen any other kids wandering around because his were missing. I noticed then that there was also a woman in the car with him, so I assumed she was the mom and he was the dad. I said no, that I hadn't seen any kids wandering around, but that there was a park nearby around the corner, and he might be able to find them there. Note, I was super proud of myself for thinking of this at 7. The man then asked if I would be willing to get in the car and show them where this park was. Although I didn't understand just how dangerous this was, I was well aware of the whole stranger danger thing, so I said no. He asked again if I would please get in the car and help him find his children at the park, and I said no, sorry, I couldn't do that. Instead, I gave him directions to the park and then skipped off to continue playing with my friends, who were standing there watching the whole time. He drove away. A few minutes later, my mom came outside to call me in for dinner. I bounced happily up the driveway to tell her how I had helped someone. I was very excited to have done this for an adult, which will bring me to my final point at the end of this. Then, I explained the whole thing to her. Her face changed a bit, but she just nervously said, "That's very nice of you, Hon," and I felt a surge of pride. And then my dad came home. Solid Navy dude, black belt, used to be in pararescue, and so badass that Chuck Norris checks under his bed for my dad every night. My mom obviously told him what had happened. His reaction was much different. He told me that although he was proud that I liked to help people, I was never, ever to approach anyone I didn't know like that again. He said, and I'll never forget this and have since passed this wisdom on to my own daughter, remember, adults should never be asking children for help like that. He told me I was lucky I hadn't gotten snatched and to always remember it because they would have lost me forever if things had gone badly. He was very stern, which hurt my little ego, and I lost a tiny bit of my innocence that day. Now that I've had 30 years of knowing my dad, I understand he was only stern because that is his reaction, and also anger when he gets scared. Poor dude. Before that, I had escaped as a toddler and was found on a cliff in Japan. Another time, I left the yard in San Antonio to sell my coloring book pages door to door. I'm sure he was wondering what fresh hell he was in with a child like me. To wrap it up, I don't remember if my parents did anything with what I told them, but it's almost certain they did because they are solid, loving folks. To my knowledge, however, nothing ever came of it, and I never heard about any similar instances again. In my late teens, I began a serious relationship with my first ever boyfriend. When I was young, I had zero confidence, no self-esteem, and a warped idea of what a relationship should be like due to witnessing those of the adults around me. Being so shy and innocent, I fell madly in love. I'm still not sure how. From the start, the relationship was controlling and abusive on his part, and it still makes me angry now, more so that I put up with it for 5 years. He hated my friends and family for no apparent reason, and I had to really fight to keep other relationships going. But as I got older, I got sick of his behavior, and when my family was going away for a weekend, I found the perfect opportunity to invite all my friends around for the evening. He tried to put a stop to it with threats and anger, but I didn't let up, and my friends arrived around 7 p.m. We were sitting in the living room, drinking and chatting with nibbles and music, but all night my boyfriend was calling my phone, demanding I make my friends leave and walk to his house to bring him alcohol. My friends soon caught wind of it, and they were already unhappy about me being with him. After a few drinks, I started to ignore the calls, and the conversation turned to my boyfriend. My friends expressed their anger and dislike of him with the usual, "You could do better, you need to get rid of him, and he doesn't deserve you." Generally, we enjoyed the evening, and my friends began to leave at 1 a.m. I wasn't afraid to be alone in the house, as I have a Rottweiler. She is friendly as hell, but I'm sure she'd protect me. As one of my male friends was about to leave, he stayed behind to give me a really deep talk about how he felt about my boyfriend, and I agreed with him. I said goodbye and watched at the front door as my friends hurried in the dark and pouring rain to their cars before I went to the kitchen, where I had left my phone to charge a little while earlier. As I picked up my phone, something in the kitchen window caught my eye. Standing directly outside my kitchen window in the dark and pouring rain, hooded and angry, was my boyfriend. He was scowling at me from the darkness. He looked ready to kill. I screamed, and we stared at each other for a while. I could see he was visibly intoxicated, as the whites of his eyes had gone pink, which made him look incredibly freaky since he has blue eyes. He turned away and disappeared. I knew I had to face him. I went out the back door onto the patio in the rain. He was standing a few feet away from me, breathing really loud and crying because he was so angry. He bent down to pick up a broken wooden broom handle. I asked him, "Are you going to use that on me?" And he said, "I'm going to hurt you so badly." I didn't know what to do. My heart was racing, but I was stuck in position and quite intoxicated. He growled as he swung the handle into a flower basket above my head, which tipped sideways and spilled soil and flowers down my right shoulder. Then he slammed it on the floor and ran at me, grabbing me around the throat. My dog must have heard him throw the handle, as she came bounding out of the back door making an angry snorting sound. She's always friendly and was familiar with him, so I didn't think she'd do anything as he started to strangle me. But she leapt up, took his arm by his sleeve, and started to shake him by the arm. Seeing the fear in his face was priceless. He backed off, and she calmed down. My boyfriend started to cry and told me that he had walked to my house a few hours ago, sneaked into the house through the back door, and hidden in the cupboard under the stairs, where he had listened to every word me and my friends had said about him. I took my dog back inside and locked the door. When I looked out of the window, he was lying on a sun lounger in the rain, crying. When he realized I wasn't coming back out, he left. The thought of him makes my stomach turn. This is the story of an experience I had in Cradle Mountain National Park in Tasmania, Australia, in my early teens. Despite causing no physical injury, it has haunted me into adulthood. I grew up in a family of avid hikers. Both my mother, a botanist, and my father, a biologist for the University of Tasmania, would regularly visit the deepest wilderness areas of Tasmania during their field studies. These trips were disguised as camping and hiking adventures for the family. I never minded, as I was just as passionate about the outdoors as they were, even from a young age. Keyword being was, as after what I went through, even 20 plus years later, I still refused to return. We lived on a property a short driving distance from Lake St. Clair, a popular tourist destination. This was the only place my parents would allow me to camp and experience the wilderness alone, as long as I brought my German Shepherd with me. He was a former police dog and very well trained. At 12 or 13 years old, I didn't mind. It felt like my own little slice of freedom in my own little slice of wilderness, despite being surrounded by people. It was easy to ignore them. But as I got older and more brazen, I found myself hounding my parents to let me take my quad bike deeper into the park to camp, to test my own abilities and prove to them that I was capable of doing so and that I wasn't a little kid anymore. It was that overconfidence that led me to that situation and caused me this trauma. I was 15 at the time of the experience, at the age where I thought I was invincible, knew all there was to know, and was untouchable. After asking my parents for what felt like an uncountable number of times and being told no just as many times, I had enough and decided to just go. I told my parents that I and a few friends were going to the lake to camp and do some fishing over the weekend. Instead, I took my tent, my quad, and headed into the reserve. I left just after sunrise to maximize daylight and to make it as far in as I felt comfortable. Once arriving, I set up camp, had some food, and decided to go for an explore. I knew of a spot nearby with a gorgeous rock face where fossils had been found in the past, so I thought I'd try my luck. Shortly into the walk, I realized I'd been turned around and had no idea where I was anymore. At the time, I didn't see it as that big of a deal, as I had a compass and knew that if I headed south, it would take me back to the lake and I could walk from there. However, by this time, it was getting late in the afternoon. So, stupidly, I decided to try my chances and make it back to my camp and quad bike so I wasn't walking back to camp from the lake in the dark. Big mistake. It was about 4:30 p.m., and the sun had begun to dip below the tree line, casting dark shadows across my walking path. That's when the forest went silent. And when I say silent, I mean silent. No wind, no birds, no forest sounds at all, which made my heart rate skyrocket. It was getting dark, and the silence was suffocating. I just wanted to get back to my camp, light a fire, eat some snacks, and spend my night watching nature's television until I fell asleep. That's when, from every direction, I would hear the sound of twigs cracking and something moving in the canopy above me. No big deal, probably birds or other small animals, I thought. But then, as clear as day, "Hey, come here." At first, I felt relieved, as I thought someone along the trails had seen me, noticed I was a bit disheveled, and wanted to help. But looking around, I saw no one. Then it happened again, but behind me this time, the same voice, but I noticed it was coming from up in the trees. I responded, "I can't see you, where are you?" and asked for some help because I thought I just couldn't see the person calling out. But then it happened again, from to my left this time. That's when I decided to run. I took off into the brush and ran for a good 2 minutes before I stopped to catch my breath and look at my compass to start making my way towards the lake. I was terrified but felt I had covered enough distance that I wasn't in immediate danger. But seconds after checking my compass and starting to walk, I heard it again, "Hey, come here," but this time it was right behind me. I spun around and saw absolutely nothing, so I began sprinting again and didn't stop. The last thing I heard before bursting out of the trees onto the lakefront was the most evil, demonic laugh I had ever heard. It sounded like 3 people laughing at once. I immediately called my parents to come and get me, told them what I did and what happened, but they were more focused on my disobedience than my experience. The moment they picked me up was the first time I felt relief, and I cried the whole drive home. I didn't sleep properly for days. My dad went and picked up my quad and tidied up my camp. Since that day, I haven't stepped foot away from the lake. If anyone has had an experience like this, I'd love to hear it because it took my passion from me. I miss being out away from society, but I can't bring myself to do it. The ladybug on my back. I'm 20 now, and this started when I was about 8 to 10. I started to get phone calls from someone with a very high-pitched voice, clearly on purpose, who would know exactly where I was, who I was with, and what we did, even with different people from different social circles. When I asked who it would say it was the ladybug on your back, and yes, I checked. He or she would call me with about 3 to 6 months in between, so I would forget about it every time and be surprised again with that bad gut feeling. But I still thought it was one of my friends just messing with me. I eventually changed my number, but it still continued. I had my suspicions about who it could be, either my friend Kim or my friend Nils. Of course, when I asked them, they had no idea what I was talking about. One day, I was with Nils when the ladybug called. I thought this was their final prank, but we left the phone on speaker and called Kim from Nils' phone. Kim answered. Now I knew it wasn't them. When I told it to go to hell and hung up, it called Nils' phone. Fast forward to the creepiest moment. I had been watching The Ring with my family. As soon as the movie ended, I got a call with it saying, "Did you watch the movie?" My gut cramped. I didn't say anything and hung up. Thankfully, this person would never threaten me or say horrible things, only knowing where I was and what I was doing. I live in a city, in an apartment, and so did my friends, so there was no way we could be watched. It started to call less frequently, but still called randomly once in a while. I started high school and eventually got a girlfriend, who no one from the old school knew or even knew about. I also got a new number. Of course, I hadn't told her about the ladybug. About 1 year into the relationship, the ladybug called my new number. This must have been 7 years after the first call. I told it to get over it already and to leave me alone. It desperately tried to call back, and when I didn't answer, it called my girlfriend. I have no idea how that was even possible, as everyone who knew about her had already been ruled out. I hadn't even told the ladybug who I was with, and it still knew who to call, just like with Nils. After that, I can't remember any calls except the latest one. It hadn't called in a very long time, but it had managed to get my new number again. I was now studying at a gymnasium, and none of my old friends went there or even knew any of my classmates were teachers. It called and said it had been sleeping with my extra teacher, the only one that only I and one more from my class had. Knew his name and everything. I haven't told anyone about him. This time, I was a lot older, and I called the police. They couldn't do anything and asked me to call my phone operator since they could track the call. The operators told me to call the police since they could track my calls. Catch 22, anyone? Since the ladybug had been calling from a hidden number, the only thing I could do had my phone line watched, but that would cost a lot for even a few days. And since the ladybug called very randomly, this wasn't an option. It's been about a year since the latest call. A strange man hunted me through a national park. I was camping in the middle of nowhere in Washington near Rainier. Not an official campground, just deep in the forest where I wouldn't have expected another human for miles. One night, I woke up and heard something. I opened my tent, and there was a guy sitting by where my fire had been, right outside my tent. Nothing particularly noteworthy about him, just a fairly regular-looking dude sitting there a couple of feet from my tent. No bag, pack, or anything with him, just a guy. He saw me open the tent, his eyes got huge, like he had just seen a ghost, and he took off. It shook me up pretty badly, but over the next day, I managed to put it out of my mind fairly well, writing it off as just some odd occurrence with a guy who was probably under the influence of something and had somehow managed to set up a camp coincidentally not far from mine. Then, 2 days later, about 10 to 15 miles away in totally random directions, so far apart that nobody could take the same path by accident, I was sitting by the fire that night and started hearing noises. I got more and more convinced they were coming from a person. I called out to them, and from the darkness, someone said, "Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?" I said no. I don't even think that's a real place there. They kept talking from just out of my line of vision. I tried to see them with my flashlight, but they yelled, "Aim that away." Kind of spooked and not wanting to upset a potentially crazy person, I did. After about 15 minutes of me being really freaked out, and them talking and asking completely random questions from the darkness, it sounded like the voice had gotten closer. So, I shined my light that way again, and it was the same dude who had been outside my tent 2 nights before. He had to have followed me almost 15 miles over 2 days, because there is no way he could have just accidentally wound up in the same spot, given how vast that wilderness is. No possible way. As soon as my light hit him, he took off again. I started to chase him, but didn't want to get lost in the wilderness in the dark, so I stopped quickly after probably only 100 to 200 feet. This couldn't be written off, because the only way he could have been in both places was if he was specifically following me. I decided the trip was very much over first thing in the morning and hiked back out over 3 days, constantly doubling back, trying to throw anyone following off my trail, and occasionally hiding and waiting to see if he would come by following me. I really can't describe how terrifying it was to feel like I was being hunted through the woods and to actually have to brainstorm ways I could best avoid potentially being murdered. On the first night of hiking out, twice I heard what sounded like a person walking circles outside my tent, but by the time I mustered the courage to look, nobody was there. On the second night, I heard what I thought was an animal making noises at first in the distance, but slowly decided it sounded more like a human making animal calls. It could have actually been an animal, but I didn't actually see the guy again. but it really sounded like a person making howling noises. I literally almost cried when I finally got back to my car. The relief was so strong. To this day, it's probably the most terrifying experience I've ever had. I have no idea who the guy was or what his intentions were, and no way of getting an explanation, but I really can't articulate just what a terrifying few days it was. Two creeps in a gas station. Some background info. I was 24 at the time, and so was my husband. Our daughter was 2. We were on a road trip to visit family, and about 20 minutes outside of the town we lived in was this large gas station with a wide variety of snacks. Whenever we went on a trip, we always stopped there for gas, drinks, and snacks. It was the middle of the day in the middle of summer. We pulled in, and my husband found a pump to fill up at. We had all gone to the bathroom before leaving the house, so I left our daughter in the car while he filled up and went inside to fill our water bottles and grab some snacks. As I said, this gas station was fairly large for the area, but not huge. The bathrooms and water fountain, with a water bottle filler, were down a fairly secluded hallway. There was only one cashier, and the line was kind of long, so I decided to buy the snacks first, then go into the hallway to fill the water bottles on the way out, in case the line got longer. Meanwhile, my husband had finished pumping gas and pulled into a parking spot in front of the building to wait for me. But all of the windows were covered with posters, so I didn't notice him. While I was in line, holding our snacks and water bottles, a couple of guys immediately got in line behind me. They were tall, and I'm 5 feet 10 inches, which is tall for a woman. I'd estimate they were at least 6 tall. They wore very nondescript clothes, khaki shorts and plain gray t-shirts. I didn't hear them speak any English, and I can't 100% confirm what language they spoke, but it sounded Middle Eastern. Edited to add, they were Caucasian. Not that their skin tone or mine matter, but I decided to add this since I'm now being accused of being racist. This wasn't super unusual for the area because there was a big college town nearby. After having my daughter, I don't like anyone being directly behind me, even family, so I turned so those guys were in my peripheral vision and looked at a display of kids' toys while I waited. I do this move a lot while I'm waiting in a line, and basically every time, nobody notices or cares that I turn so I can see people. And they certainly don't move around while waiting in line nearly as much as these guys did. But one of them was fully staring at me, and his expression was just plain unsettling. But he hadn't done anything, so I just smiled, gave a half nod, and looked away while still keeping them in my field of view. They were whispering among themselves, even though nobody could understand their language, and it wasn't exactly quiet in there. But I just had this gut feeling they were talking about me because they both kept openly staring at me and nobody else, even though it was fairly busy. Then they started moving so they were directly behind me. And for 4 minutes straight, I looked at my phone. Every time I moved because I was uncomfortable with them directly behind me, they moved to be directly behind me again. Every time they would look at something on display, but it just seemed so forced, like they weren't actually interested in the unicorn toys and were just looking at them to be behind me. About every 15 seconds for 4 minutes while we were in line, it kept happening over and over. They'd even go back and look at something they'd already seen. They went back to the same unicorn toy 4 times. I felt like I was crazy, because maybe one of them had a daughter or a niece who would like it. But every time I looked close enough, they were staring at me, watching me. I was seriously freaked out, but I kept telling myself that they weren't after me or anything. But just to be safe, I decided not to fill the water bottles and just go straight to the car. It wasn't worth risking it. I was still 3 people away from the front of the line. There was some sort of issue with a membership card that held up the line, and more people had lined up behind the men. One was a middle-aged woman and her teenager, 13 to 14 years old. The woman saw my discomfort and saw how they kept getting behind me over and over. so she sent her teenager to see if the self-checkouts were open. At this gas station, it was a 50-50 chance they were, as they went down a lot. Meanwhile, those men were getting closer and closer. I'd already gotten as close to the person in front of me as socially allowed, but they were breathing down my neck and even brushing against me while they looked at the displays of candy and unicorn toys. I was contemplating leaving the snacks on the counter and walking out. The teenager came back and must have whispered to the woman that the self-checkout was open. Then the woman walked up to me, took me by the arm, and led me to the self-checkout. We watched each other's backs while we checked out. I looked up and saw them still staring at me, and this time they looked fully angry at me. They were about to come talk to me when she grabbed my bag and receipt for me and walked me out to my car. Somehow, she was so smooth with everything, I don't even think her teenager noticed what was going on. Once we were outside, and I saw my car right there with my husband and my kid inside, I gave her a hug and thanked her for her help getting me out of there. Then we parted ways. I told my husband about everything, trying not to get too emotional about it, just stating facts about what they did and how they behaved. He seemed equally freaked out by my description of the events and wished he had the chance to properly thank that woman. I filled our water bottles at the next gas station, and we moved out of that area about 6 months later. Anyway, if that woman sees this, you're my hero. Thank you. I don't think I can fully describe how deeply uncomfortable I was in that situation. I was genuinely scared they'd follow me to my car or something. After work drinks. I was around 17 at the time. This was a few years ago, and I was working in Topman. There was a sale on, and as you can imagine, it was chaotic. I worked in a rough area in London, but I've lived around there for years, so nothing really fazed me. It's notorious for gang activity and stabbings, but it was still home. I usually worked alone in my side of the shop, with Top Shop being on the other side. I was frantic at the tills, processing purchases, when a man came to the desk looking distressed. He must have been in his 50s, wearing a black puffer coat and joggers. "I've lost my phone," he said, pointing to the sale rack to the right of the store. I followed him as he walked over to the rack. It was 2 racks of clothes pushed quite close to each other. I looked under the racks, and there it was, his phone, placed perfectly in the middle of the racks. There was no way it could have fallen like that. I picked it up and passed it to him. "Thank you so much, my angel, my angel, my angel," he said, seeming very theatrical with his actions. "It's okay, no problem," I said as I turned to go back to the till. "How can I repay you?" he asked as I turned. "You really don't have to." "It only took a second," I said, smiling. He then asked me what time I finished work. I lied and said 3 o'clock, even though I was on close that day, and at this point, it was around 10 a.m. "I'll see you after work," he said with a straight face as he walked out of the shop. I shrugged it off and continued my long, chaotic shift. It came to closing time, around 8 p.m. My colleagues and I were locking up and started to leave together. As I stepped out of the doors, I noticed him, the same man as earlier, sitting on the bench, looking at us. I started to follow my colleagues. I was pretty quiet and didn't really socialize much with them, trailing behind. The guy got up and said to me that he wanted to take me for a drink to thank me. I explained I had to get back and that I was actually 17, so I couldn't drink. I turned to walk away, but he grabbed my arm, ushering me down an alleyway, insisting I come for a drink. I looked down the alleyway and saw a blacked-out SUV with a guy holding the door open. I tried to pull away from him, and he grabbed my arm again. This was on a high street with loads of shops around, so there were a few people nearby. I was still trying to be nice to him as I declined multiple times, my naive 17-year-old self just trying to be polite, until his face dropped, and he pulled me towards the alleyway. Fight or flight finally kicked in, and I threw myself on the floor. He let go, and I sprinted to the bus stop. I told my then boyfriend, and he came to pick me up from the bus stop. I don't know why, but I never called the police or anything. I told my mom a couple of years later, and she told me how serious it was. For some reason, it never really occurred to me, and I brushed it off previously. Thankfully, nothing serious happened that night. I'm 25, male, on vacation in Kauai with my mom and sister. We rented a townhome with 2 bedrooms, and mine was upstairs. One of the nights, I was woken up by what I thought sounded like a doorbell. As I opened my eyes from a deep sleep, wondering if I was hearing things, the doorbell rang again. I sat up fast to check the time. It was 3 a.m. I slowly got out of bed and started walking to leave my bedroom when I heard the doorbell again. The silence after almost made me feel like I was dreaming because no one else was waking up from this. And since Kauai is pretty rural, it was eerily silent. As I reached the stairs that lead straight down to the front door, I stopped and listened to see if I could hear anything. A couple of seconds passed, and I finally said, "Hello," from the top of the stairs. In return, a shaky old lady's voice said, "Can you help me? And can I come in?" At that moment, I thought I was in a horror movie or something. My body froze, and I was actually terrified. I went back to my room, which had a balcony where I could see who was at the door if they walked away. It was a little old lady in a white gown, walking away barefoot. I ended up calling the police and asked the lady if she needed help while I was on the balcony. She said her husband had gotten into a car accident down the street. I told her the cops were on their way to help, and she just started slowly walking away. She didn't get far when the cops showed up, and I could hear him call her by her first name. That's when I realized she had dementia and was wandering the neighborhood. It was sad to see, but I had never been more scared. It must have been all the paranormal horror movies my parents made us watch when we were kids. The next night, I was walking back from the jacuzzi at around 10 or 11, and as I turned the corner to walk down the street, there she was again, near the front of her house, but under a streetlight. I knew she was harmless, but just seeing a very old lady in that white gown and barefoot again, standing under the light, was a terrifying thing to witness. As I was walking toward her, she turned around and started waddling towards me, just adding to the horror. It's more of a funny story at this point, but I think about it all the time. This incident occurred about 6 years ago when I was about 21 years old, male. Since I was a young kid, a great interest of mine has been herpetology, the study of reptiles and amphibians, and going out searching for those types of critters, or herping, is my favorite hobby. South Louisiana, where I live, is a great place for herping and a really good place to find my favorite animals, snakes. On the day of the incident, I was preparing to search for snakes on a road that ran through a swamp near Lake Pontchartrain by slowly driving the road and catching snakes that were crossing it. It was late afternoon, and I had stopped at a gas station to fill my truck up before heading out to the herping spot. This particular gas station had a reputation for violent robberies and other unsavory activities, but they also had the cheapest gas prices in town, and it was still light out, so I wasn't too worried. I was pumping gas and daydreaming when an old late model sedan, which looked like it had seen better days, pulled up beside me. In the car were 4 thuggish young men staring at me. The driver, a very big individual in his late 20s or early 30s, regarded me out of the open window. I instantly got very nervous as I had no idea what they wanted. After a few seconds, the driver said, "Hey, little boy, I got that morphine." I realized they were trying to sell me substances. I replied, "Nah, man." The driver said again, "Come on, little boy, I got that morphine," and again I told him no. The driver tried several more times to push his substances, each time calling me some variant of little boy. I am a very small young man with a slight build, and even to this day, I could pass as a teenager. While I am fine with this, I don't like constantly being reminded of it, and I certainly don't like someone using my small stature to intimidate me into doing something I don't want to do. I finally got fed up and yelled at the driver, "No, I don't want any morphine. Go away and leave me alone." This drew the attention of several other customers, which caused the guy to leave quickly, squealing his tires as he did. I paid for my gas and headed on out to the road through the swamp. The road gets little traffic, as there is a major interstate next to it. Mostly, the traffic consists of people fishing or launching boats, so it is great for her ping. I stopped my truck at the place where I wanted to begin my search and began going through several pillowcases that held the snakes I had found on a previous trip that I needed to let go. Inside each pillowcase, most of which contained small harmless water snakes, was a scrap of paper that had the mile along the stretch of road where they were found so that I knew where to release them. I was making a list of these for efficiency's sake so that I could quickly release each one and get on with my search. I was checking a case that held a greater than 4 feet long rat snake when the same late model sedan pulled to a stop behind my truck. All 4 of the occupants piled out and began walking toward me. The driver, who must have weighed a solid 260, was coming straight at me, and while the others were fanning out around me, the driver started yelling, "What's up, little boy? You don't want my stuff? We gonna see what your little punk self does now." I was scared to death and had to work very hard to keep my knees from buckling under. I thought about the tire iron in my truck and realized that I would not be able to dig it out before they got to me, and that fear had drained the strength from me so that I wouldn't be able to use it effectively anyway. So, I did the only thing I could think to do. I reached into the pillowcase and pulled out the rat snake. The snake instantly drew itself into a coil and began to gape and hiss. The 4 individuals, now only a few feet away, realized what was in my hand and immediately stopped their advance. When the driver began to back up, the movement caught the snake's attention and it lunged out in his direction. At this, the 4 of them began screaming and cursing loudly and hastily piled back into their car. They took off so quickly that they hit the median and nearly tore out the bottom of the old car. I stood there, shaking, unable to move for a few minutes. The intimidating but harmless rat snake began to squirm around and latched onto my hand, so I had to come out of my fear-induced coma. I quickly drove to the release points of all the snakes I had and let them go, thanking the rat snake as it slithered into the vegetation and went immediately home without doing any herping.